Good morning. It's 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we will, in a moment, dive back into the Diane Abbot story for reasons that I will explain to you shortly. Not least that it gets the old grey cells whirring at a rate of cogs if you let it. I'd like to know, I don't currently have plans to talk about the situation in Sudan, just because I've got nothing really to add to what you already know, the race against time to save 4,000 British people there, the sadly predictable failure, really, of the Foreign Office, I'm afraid, to step up to the plate. James cleverly carrying the can for that one. There was a particularly poignant headline in the Daily Telegraph, of all places. I don't know if you saw it, but I shall bring it to your attention first. Very simply states, Britons saved from Sudan by Germany and France. This is France and Germany rescuing British nationals trapped in Sudan amid criticism that the government has been slow to help citizens left behind. There has been movement this morning. There are announcements from the Foreign Office that planes are being deployed, but certainly overnight France confirmed that it had rescued a significant number of people from other European countries, including the UK. Germany also saying that it had ferried home Britons. There'll still be plenty of people stuck there, and it's still obviously a nightmare. So what I thought I would do, alongside the other conversations we're going to have on the programme today, is just ask if you've got family there. I mean, most obviously Sudanese family, but if you've got expats or immigrants in your family who are living in Sudan at the moment, I sometimes think the only way we can add to what you're hearing in the bulletins or what you're hearing from foreign correspondents or people on the ground is the personal connection, the family connection. So I will periodically remind you in the course of the programme this morning that if you've got family in Sudan, or if by any chance you're listening to me there, what's going on? What is it actually like in the eye, if you will, of the storm? 0345 6060973 remains the number that you need. So there are a couple of reasons. Well, there's a bunch of reasons why I want to return to the conversation about Diane Abbot. Who are the people that you respect enough to review your opinions depending on what they say? I mean in the public eye. And I don't mean you agree with everything they say. It's tricky, isn't it? We live in a world, I often think. In fact, I increasingly think this. I don't know whether you've noticed. I probably spend a bit too much time on Twitter that is healthy, so that may have slightly coloured my outlook. But you live in a world where there's a sort of bogus expectation of perfection or infallibility. You find one alleged flaw, it doesn't even have to be real or evidential, in somebody's record, and in a social media world, that can then be moulded into reasons not to trust them on anything. If, for example, you've been right about, let's just say, Brexit, Boris Johnson and Donald Trump over the last few years, people will be particularly desperate to pretend that your credibility is undermined by the fact that you, I don't know, voted for Boris Johnson in the London mayoral election in 2008 or something like that. And it extends both ways. You know, it goes both ways. The reason I mention it is that the journalist Afua Hirsch, the journalist and author Afua Hirsch, of whom I am an enormous admirer, tweeted something this morning that just stopped me a little bit in my tracks. She wrote, "Can't believe this needs to be said of the Diane Abbot situation. She made a mistake and apologised. Now you're all having a debate where there isn't one. What there is, however, is undeniable bloodthirstiness to take down a black woman who's been enduring attack since before I was born. There are people making noise about this on live TV who told me to my face they didn't care about Boris Johnson's anti-blackness so long as he was clear on anti-Semitism. Maybe this is an opportunity for us all to reflect on what anti-racism actually is. Thankfully, there are many examples of solidarity between black, Jewish, Muslim, traveller and other minoritised communities against the distinct but overlapping struggles we all face in Britain. Strangely, these are not the voices I'm seeing centred in media coverage of this debate." I don't know that I fully agree with Afua on that, or even perhaps partly agree with her on all of it, if that's a thing. And I can't control who rings into the programme, obviously, but I would remind you that if you are a member of any of the other communities singled out in Diane Abbott's bizarre letter, then my phone line is as open for you as it is for anybody else. I don't think we heard, for example, yesterday from anyone from the traveller community, who I think were impugned or at least insulted by Diane Abbott. And there is what Julie describes in her first text of the morning. There is a gleeful sense of a pylon against a woman who has suffered the most egregious racism for decades. Now, you are not my therapist. I know I sometimes treat you like my therapist, but you are not my therapist. If you were, I'd have to pay you, and that would be ridiculous, a complete reversal of the natural order. But if you were my professional therapist, like my work therapist, if such a thing existed, I would talk to you a little bit this morning about how you walk that line, I have a very sincere sense of disgust at what she did, and I'm not buying the apology either, because I find the notion of a first draft that was sent by accident laughable. That's why I think an inquiry is essential. But I am completely clear that Julie Suffolk is correct when she talks about a gleeful sense of pylon, and these are my words, not hers, from people who would have been part of the racist abuse of Diane Abbott over the years. But it would be dishonourable to step back from your own criticism because you don't like the company that you're keeping, I think, wouldn't it? I don't find myself in positions like this very often, but that's what is so egregious and so extraordinary about Diane Abbott's intervention in The Observer on Sunday. So I think an awful lot of people who would be deeply abusive of Diane Abbott, racist, misogynist, I've got some coming in already on my texts, I'll probably not read them out. It's not really Idiot's Corner stuff, that kind of thing. It's bile duct territory. But they will be, you perhaps, if you're listening, you will be loving this. You're loving this strident, successful black woman being publicly, metaphorically stoned. But that can't let the rest of us step back from our positions of sincere and fairly profound criticism. At least I don't think it can. And that takes me to a nice piece today in the newspaper by Simon Kellner, which appears under the headline. It's a fairly self-explanatory headline. I am Jewish, but I find it hard to be outraged by Abbott's letter. I'm not Jewish, and I don't. Simon Kellner writes, what I am, however, is perplexed, bemused, and even astounded by the lack of judgment and political nous shown by Ms. Abbott. So he's certainly not making any excuses or giving her a free pass, but he is, I think, close to Afua Hirsch on this. Sometimes politicians say the wrong thing when they are drawn into potentially sticky situations not of their making. The classic cock-up, you may say, and at other times they may be. So he's going for this. She did something stupid. She said sorry. We should move on. And moving on in that context would involve her being invited back into the Parliamentary Labour Party. And that, I think, is where the story goes next. Let's look at it from an entirely utilitarian point of view. And I'd thank my colleague Connor for this insight. If you were looking at it from a purely pragmatic point of view, solely on optics and political capital, why on earth would Keir Starmer let her back into the Parliamentary Labour Party? Anti-Semitism remains a truly toxic ghost of the Jeremy Corbyn years, and I accept some people believe that is unfair, but you can't argue with the reality of it. It's the same people. That's why Afua Hirsch's point is so powerful. People who told her to her face they didn't care about Boris Johnson's recorded racism against black people, whether it's smiling pickaninnies or watermelon smiles. But anti-Semitism became a terrible stick with which to beat the Labour Party, and the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn was horribly ill-equipped to fight off those blows. But you still condemn the anti-Semitism. You just because the bad guys, in quotes, are using something to hurt the Labour Party doesn't mean you stop pointing out the problems in the Labour Party just because you might historically lean more towards them than you do towards the other lot. So, you know, it's a question really of pragmatism versus principle. I think you would struggle pragmatically to make the case for Diane Abbott returning to the Labour Party, the Parliamentary Labour Party. I don't see any gains at all for Keir Starmer doing that. I mean, it opens him up to. There's a silly piece in the Mail today. Well, there's something you can say every day without even opening the paper. There's a silly piece in the Mail today claiming that it has set them back to the Corbyn days on the anti-Semitism question. If Keir Starmer had moved any quicker, he'd have burnt himself in withdrawing the whip from Diane Abbott. The polar opposite of what the Conservative Party seems to do at the moment when it's got trouble in the ranks. I don't think anyone would describe Rishi Sunak's leadership as strong and robust. But the problem remains for Starmer that if he were to let her back into the party, those accusations, whether they're fair or not, would gather pace. They would gather momentum, if you pardon the pun. They would open up Starmer's leadership to accusations of, still leading a party or leading a party that is still a bit too comfortable with that kind of comment, that kind of language. I've seen also, speaking of people whose opinions I follow with interest, I've also seen people claiming that there is, and I think this popped up in the Ford report, that the idea of a hierarchy, that the Labour Party is concerned more with racism of an anti-Semitic flavour than it is with anti-black racism. My understanding of that, which could be wrong, was almost like a to-do list. Of course, the Labour Party in its current guise is going to be more concerned with anti-Semitism than other forms of racism, because it is the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party that has caused them such enormous problems over the last 4 or 5 years. But again, that might be me being a little bit rose-tinted or naive. But I don't see this as being a conversation just about Jews. It's about travellers and it's about Irish people as well. It's also, in a weird way, about redheads. So it's a conversation about lots of people, but it's mostly a conversation about Diane Abbott. And you now know what she did. You now know what she said. You now know what her apology is. And although her apology is full-throated, it's, for my mind, it's not good enough. And I do think, and I sometimes tie myself in knots with my own white privilege, but I do think I'm entitled to hold that opinion, and I do think I'm entitled to expound it publicly. That apology is not good enough, which is why an inquiry is needed. But what an inquiry could find that in any way opens the door for a exculpation, i.e. a removal of blame, I can't quite imagine. Hey, how many people have written a first draft of a letter that was as mind-bogglingly obnoxious as what Diane Abbott wrote? I mean, what the hell would the second draft have looked like? Unless it was actually expounding points completely at odds with the points made in the first draft, it couldn't possibly have signalled much of an improvement. So what do you think? And remember that if you can. I might be being a bit up myself on this, but the principal pragmatism point. So if Keir Starmer acted on principle, would his answer to this question be different from if he acts entirely on political pragmatism? Should she be allowed back into the Parliamentary Labour Party? She's 70, I think, before the next election. I mention that only to highlight the length of her career. I'm not suggesting that age is an obstacle to office, but the length of her career, much of which has been typified by passionate anti-racism and appalling abuses. But I can't currently see a way back in for her. And the fly in the ointment of my conviction is Afua Hirsch's point. But I don't think we can do that, can we? Just because people you find disgusting are queuing up to attack her doesn't mean you dial down your own disgust for fear of allying yourself with obnoxiousness. I think that makes sense. Anyway, that's where I am this morning. Where are you? And don't ring me up and say Stoke Newington. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. There's principle and pragmatism in place, but what should Keir Starmer do? And I don't think there's an objective answer to this question. I think there's lots of subjective ones. What I mean by that is I don't think we drive towards consensus on this because we are all different. We all look at this story differently. And you, depending on your background, depending on your heritage, may arrive at completely different answers from me. I think the last person to use the first draft excuse was Jeremy Clarkson, actually, as Ed points out, who also wrote disgusting things, in his case, about an individual member of the royal family, about Meghan Markle. His career has been characteristically unaffected by his disgusting intervention. That's the way it works. But that's when we come back to Michelle Obama, isn't it? When they go low, we go high. I don't think you can use Jeremy Clarkson's relatively absent punishment for being disgusting to suggest that Diane Abbott deserves the same treatment. That's Keir Starmer's decision, and he has to hold Diane Abbott to a much higher standard, I would argue, than Jeremy Clarkson's employers hold him to. That's kind of the point, isn't it? Anyway, the phone lines are open. 0345 6060 973. 21 minutes after 10 is the time. I'll hit the phones imminently. I'm just going to read this because I think it's important to reflect this sort of criticism. James, I'm so tired of listening to white people telling black people how they should feel and speak about their own experiences. When I leave my front door, it is clear and obvious that I am black. When you leave your house, it is not clear that you are Irish or Jewish, therefore you will not suffer the immediate racism. You do not have to adjust yourself and prepare for the inevitable discrimination and racism that is experienced by black people. You have allowed your programme, again, to be more sympathetic to the Jewish point of view whilst challenging and not accepting that black people do have different perspectives. Please, if you cannot accept your own prejudices, try not to be an expert in my pain. I'm deeply uncomfortable refuting that accusation for obvious reasons, so I will confine myself to this. If that's what Diane Abbott had actually said, then there'd be no controversy, there'd be no beef, and there'd be no phone-in. But she didn't. She did not say that. She said that people in those categories that you've also ignored, Irish people and travellers, did not experience racism, and that's just objectively wrong and deeply offensive and very stupid. If your analysis was correct, then she wouldn't have needed to apologise for anything. So I understand the point that you're making. I don't think on this occasion that it's pertinent to the problem that's under discussion, but I shall certainly take on board your broader points. 23 minutes after 10 is the time. Jordan is in Southampton. Jordan, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James.
Hello.
So, I'm a science teacher by trade, and I work a lot in mental health and people getting emotional when making mistakes under stressful situations. And I hope you don't mind a short ADHD scenic route to the point I'm going to make. I'll try and make it concise and quick. Okay. So, I've dealt with people online, people stressed and emotional, whether it's white-winged people, and they generally have the idea that something's wrong, whether it's the economic problems, job insecurity, wealth inequality, but they'll blame immigrants and the EU.
Yes.
On the left wing, the same thing. They're stressed about a lot of injustices in the world, rightly so. But then that turns into hashtag all men are trash and all white people are racist. So it's kind of the solution.
I don't see a balance here, Jordan. I appreciate you said you were going to take the scenic route, but I subscribe very much to the second school of thought without subscribing to either of the hashtags that you cited, whereas blaming the EU or immigrants for everything that's gone wrong is common to pretty much everybody in this country who describe themselves as right-wing.
No, you're absolutely right. And the point I'm trying to make is that the comment, humble as ever, the point I'm trying to make is that obviously comments disgusting, anti-Semitic.
But it's a letter. It's not a tweet or a throwaway comment.
Makes it even worse. Which makes it even worse. I'm more disappointed that she is an MP. And I think a point I'm trying to make is that whilst, now that it's happened, it needs to be dealt with, and I think Keir Starmer was right to deal with it so quickly. The counter to that is dealing with the cause. If MPs such as Diane Abbott hadn't felt that it was undealt with for so long, and that, as many people view, there was an over-focus on anti-Semitism, arguably for tactical reasons. I'm not going to debate that. But if Keir Starmer wanted to avoid that view, that he was preferring one type of racism over the other, then really he should have dealt with all the other types of racism.
And that's her frustration.
A lot sooner.
That's her frustration, and you could even describe it as a trauma, given her life, given her lived life, and therefore a fair investigation, a fair inquiry will look at whether that kind of emotional subtext, it's not even a subtext, that emotional context, can help explain her behaviour, which is, by her own admission, completely unacceptable, and that would lower the bar to re-entry into the Parliamentary Labour Party.
I think it would. I would just like to see Starmer not show a little bit more, be more proactive on this rather than reactive.
Okay.
I think a lot of the voters want to see that as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, he'll know better than we do the answer to the second bit of it, because they'll be focus grouping and polling it into exhaustion. But yeah, I mean, it remains an issue. When you use the word prefer, others might use the word prioritise. I would account for it by saying that the Labour Party didn't have a massive public problem with any other kind of racism when Keir Starmer became leader. Therefore, there is an ineluctable logic to focusing more on one than another. But I'm white. If I was black and I'd been a victim of racism in the Labour Party and the Ford report found that was perfectly possible, then I would almost certainly feel differently. Of course I would. Thank you, Jordan. Chris is in Barnet. Chris, what would you like to say?
Hi, well, I think that Diane Abbott has been debating about these subjects of racism and so on for many years, so she should have known a lot better.
Yes.
And I think that the anti-Semitic issue that Labour has had, which Keir Starmer has dealt with quite well, will all go backwards. He would lose everything that he's gained if he doesn't take Diane Abbott out of the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And I think that, it wasn't as if she just made up these issues, out of 2 seconds. She's had years to think about these things. So whatever she came up and wrote this letter, I mean, she actually sat down and wrote this letter. And if it wasn't something that she agreed with, she could have thrown that letter away and write another one. But she didn't. She sent it, and she took steps to put these views forward. And therefore, she can't now just say, sorry, that's something that I made a mistake of.
I understand your point, but sincere apology has to have a place in public life. Otherwise,
of course it does.
So what place does it have here then, Chris?
Well, I think that apology is not a genuine apology, because if it was a genuine apology, she wouldn't have wrote that in the first place.
I don't know that you can do that, can you? I mean, your point about how long she's had and how long she's spent wrestling with these issues is incredibly strong. Well, but is it not? I mean, no, because neither of us can quite imagine, can we, reading something that we wrote and just being goggle-eyed at how ridiculous it was. I mean, that's the problem here, isn't it? Is that you can swear blind that you're sorry and that it's a terrible mistake, but to have written that and then to wake up the next morning, see it in the newspaper and think, oh my God, how did I do that? Yes. That's the bit we can't quite get through.
Well, this is it. Unfortunately for Diane Abbott, because of Corbyn and because of the closeness of Corbyn and because of the anti-Semitic issues that was at the time, people are going to connect that and will go against the Labour Party and against Starmer. So I think Starmer...
Well, it already has. I mean, page 14 of the Daily Mail today, if Starmer doesn't kick Diane Abbott out of the party, it'll prove his pledge to banish anti-Semitism from Labour means nothing. But that's not... Just because it's in the Daily Mail doesn't mean it's... I mean, usually if it's in the Daily Mail, it means it's not true. So that doesn't... Just because it's been written in the Daily Mail doesn't mean it's true. But you believe that as well. You also think it would seriously undermine his pledge to lance the anti-Semitism boil.
I think Starmer would be the best Prime Minister we'll ever have if he ever gets to become Prime Minister. I think he takes decisions. He doesn't want to show, like Rishi Sunak, that he takes his time and he doesn't take decisions straight away.
Dithering.
And I think that he should, I think he must show what he's been showing up to now.
Okay. No, I guess that's in a sense. I don't want to trivialise the conversation that we're having, but it is a bit like 1-1 with the first two callers. And just to point out again the media machinations on a story like this, the Daily Mail's news story, the headline I read you a moment ago is from the comment pages. The news pages have this frankly ridiculous headline: Keir is forced to condemn Abbott over anti-Semitism. Do give me a call if you saw anyone holding a gun to his head or holding his feet to the fire or putting pressure on him to do what, as far as I could tell, he did the minute he found out about what Diane Abbott had done. But the Daily Mail can't report that. He has to be forced to do it. Forced to condemn Diane Abbott. So if you've got any evidence at all of him looking like he's doing it under duress or as a consequence of being forced, then let me know on 0345 6060 973. Thomas Watts is here with your headlines. 10:34 is the time, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where what would Keir do? What should Keir do? Keir Starmer, with reference to Diane Abbott and her still, eye-wateringly awful letter to the Observer at the weekend. The Jewish Chronicle has got hold of a scoop this morning that I can share with you. very simply, she sent it twice, a week earlier than publication. So she sent 2 copies, three hours apart, identically worded, and there was a week between dispatch of emails and publication of letter, during which she didn't want to come back and seek to make changes or suggest that she'd sent the first draft by accident twice. Now, that's the point at which some of the people that you're talking about would mock her or question her intelligence or her sobriety even. I'm not going to do that. But that's why you have an inquiry. That's why there has to be an investigation. And I can't currently see what answer would come that lets her off the hook. Speaking of investigations, a couple of people yesterday, not many, and it was borderline Idiot's Corner territory, to be honest with you, wondered why we were talking about Diana Abbott so much and not talking about someone called Andrew Edwards, who is a Tory councillor currently under investigation after a recording surfaced in which he allegedly says that all white men should have a black slave. And the answer is twofold and pretty blooming obvious, which is why I thought it was Idiot's Corner territory. There was no prospect of him becoming Home Secretary if the Labour Party had won the last election, or indeed if the Conservative Party had won the last election. And I don't know for sure that he did. So you have to wait for that investigation before you can have a conversation about it like this. Whereas we know that Diane Abbott sent that letter. The investigation isn't into whether or not it was her that sent it. The investigation is into what the hell was going on when she did. So they're 2 completely different propositions. It's one of those horseshoe scenarios where the far right and the far left seem to almost join each other with willful ignorance. Speaking of Idiot's Corner, Dean is keen not to be put in it. I'm in Sheffield, he starts. That's no obstacle to being an Idiot's Corner at the same time, Dean. Call me a conspiracy theorist, but what if Abbott purposely released the article to cause issues for Starmer and Labour before the local elections? I wonder what the far left will do when the general election comes around. Please don't put me in Idiot's Corner, says Dean. I won't. But I don't think that is what has happened here. 10:37 is the time. Aisha is in Stratford. Aisha, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning,
Hello.
James. It's just that you have, I think, Keir Starmer. When I first heard the story and he suspended her,
Yes.
I did like the others that you've said, thought that was a knee-jerk. But when I reread and listened to LBC throughout the day, people, and reread her letter, what springs to mind is two things. First one, does Diana Abbott understand that it's anti-Semitic?
Yes.
Number one. Number two, her being, the mistake people are making, her being a graduate of Oxford doesn't mean she will understand that.
No.
And the very third thing is, yesterday I was 50-50 on Keir Starmer, but Keir Starmer, after reading about the Equality Commission and all the issues he had around the Jewish, he had no option but to suspend her. Mm. And if the investigation turns out to be accurate, then that's what she's done is anti-Semitic, it's defined as and is fair, then she cannot stand in Stoke Newington for the Labour Party. Unfortunately, we're going to have to lose Diana Abbott to some very sad circumstances. The other thing I want to say, James, is the Labour Party is continuously having these issues. And as a black person, I would say we invested a lot on understanding black issues, understanding slavery. But I don't think we're investing enough in understanding the Jewish, their problems. Like, for example, my family, we started a journey to understand the Jewish. Mm. And we started
What's your background, if you don't mind me asking?
I am, in what way? You mean race-wise?
Yes.
I'm black and I'm Muslim.
Okay.
And I have nothing but respect for the Jewish after reading about what happened to them in the German in Holocaust and stuff. But we started our journey, and I'll give away in a minute. We started our journey by going to an exhibition called.
Hang on a minute. I'll give way in a minute. I'll give way in a minute as well. This is not Aisha is not setting a precedent on this programme on what happens when I'm about to interrupt people. Just for the record,
I know you will
Aisha, carry on.
In a minute. But, I know you very well. So I went to an exhibition called Seeing Auschwitz. I think it's gone now to South Africa. Yeah. The reason why I took steps for me and my children and my family, especially I've got special needs children, to understand the Jewish is because actually we don't invest ourselves. We don't embrace them to understand them. Okay. I was fundraising. I sat with them during my fundraising time. They explained their history. But when I see that we don't even know, yesterday I didn't even know whether Jewish are a race or is an ethnicity, or that's the situation Diana seemed to be in. And it's not because she's an MP. It's not because she's been to Cambridge. We need to invest in understanding the Jewish.
Well, I would go.
They mix with us.
I'd jump in at this point probably and say we need to invest in understanding each other more, actually, as opposed to one direction of traffic. Because a lot of people listening would struggle with the idea that society in general puts more effort into understanding the history of slavery, for example, than it does the Holocaust. Society in general, which is why I wanted to clarify your background, because I think that's very pertinent to what you said. Well, no, I get that now. What about her return to the Parliamentary Labour Party? How do you feel about that prospect? Can you see a way back for her?
It depends on the results of the investigation. If it's anti-Semitic,
but what could come out? What could come out in the investigation that would let her off the hook here? Especially now we know she sent it twice, a week before it was published.
Hold on.
I'm holding.
If she doesn't understand, if she's not educated, because I think the Labour Party, with all the issues they've had, they need themselves. You know the way organisations do, and that's why I'm saying we invested a lot in Black, doing unconscious bias training, all these kind of thing training. We need to do the same thing, understanding the Jewish problem that they had, the Holocaust. Gosh. That's why me and my family have taken the steps to do every single thing. On the point, we will be going to the British Library, we will be going to workshops, we will be travelling to understand them the same way the world invested in understanding slavery. Because these are the two big events, in my view. That's the only ones I know.
Well, I think they're both Holocausts, actually. And
they're both Holocausts.
The reason why your perspective is so interesting is because I haven't heard it before. And you know, as a Black Muslim woman, that is, to me, absolutely fascinating. The idea that you have grown up, if you like, in a world where one has been prioritised over the other, when I think most people listening would probably have prioritised it a different way around. But that's the whole point, isn't it? We have grown up differently. We have experienced different influences. I'm cracking on, Aisha, because there's so many people waiting to talk. But I think this is a very timely moment to bring intersectionality into the conversation, which Aisha has just given a wonderful introduction to. It's probably going to become one of those words like diversity or unconscious bias or white privilege that dangerous people who love ignorance because it keeps them in positions of power and influence will either deliberately or sincerely not understand. They'll either pretend not to understand it or won't understand it. I find it incredibly helpful. It's best understood as a way in which there are lots of different social and political identities that combine to create lots of different modes of discrimination and privilege. So, for example, Diane Abbott's letter to the Observer discounted the existence of Black Jews, someone who could be a victim of skin-based racism and of anti-Semitism, and someone who perhaps, as a Black Jew, could receive racism from white Jews. You know, the intersectionality is fascinating. I'd bring class into it, class, wealth, gender, sexuality. There are countless things that could be part of intersectionality. And I felt that Diane Abbott's letter read like a denial of intersectionality. There's so many different things: sexual orientation, appearance, ability, mental health, race, gender identity. And you're not suggesting that they're all equal, but there is a strong argument for that, I think, that I find very compelling. Thank you, Aisha. Sasha's in Newham. Sasha, what would you like to say?
Thanks. I would like to say that I think that Diane was right to apologise. Yes. I think that it's right for there to be an investigation. However, my concerns are if that investigation and the outcome is her expulsion from the Labour Party, it may look like a factional move when you have MPs like Rupert Huck and Steve Reid who have actually committed acts of racism.
What did Steve Reid do? I remember what Rupert Huck did. Forgive me, I'm not fully across what Steve Reid did.
He tweeted that Richard Desmond was the puppet master to the entire Tory cabinet in relation to the planning scandal. But that's an obvious anti-Semitic trope.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is an anti-Semitic trope. Nobody can argue with that. But I suspect if Steve Reid were here, he'd say he would have used exactly the same language to describe someone who isn't Jewish. So I mean, his crime is not being more careful.
You would assume that there would be some investigation or some sort of... I think, and I come from a trade union background, that suspension pending an investigation should be a neutral act. It should be viewed as such. It's not a punitive act. It's
but it has to.
act.
Yeah, but I mean that's
and that the same action should have been taken with Steve. It should be viewed as a neutral act, pending an investigation
when was this?
And pending the outcome. 2020.
Okay, so under Corbyn.
2020.
No, under Starmer. Steve Reed said that about Richard Desmond.
Yes.
Okay, I didn't know that. It can't be though, can it? Hang on, it can't be. It can't be. What was the phrase that you used to describe the sort of atmosphere of objectivity? A neutral suspension, because that would overlook the different responses to different actions. I understand why you.
No, a neutral.
But it can't be neutral because the letter is here.
Act.
So, for example, there has to be a difference between something that was sent twice a week before publication and something that was tweeted in the heat of the moment, doesn't there? Just straight off, there has to be a difference.
Well, that's what the investigation. So
I don't need an investigation to know that, and nor do you.
No, but the investigation should explore and should understand more as to why that letter went out.
Yeah, okay. And I look forward. No, hang on. I want to examine what you've already said. I really do, because it's very interesting. And it's interesting that you use the word factionality. Can I ask whether you see yourself as being in a faction?
I do.
Yeah, and it would be Diane Abbott's faction.
I actually wouldn't say it would be in Diane Abbott. I'm on the left, but I personally
I'm not trying to trip you up.
No, but I've got no problem with that. I personally don't agree with the letter that was sent, but I think you have to address whether what was sent was a racist act or whether it was a poor opinion on racism. And I think they are two different things.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that. Give me an example.
And I think
hang on, because we're going to run out of time.
Society. Well, I'll move on very quickly. I think part of the problem we have in our society is the way that we deal with racist acts.
Yes.
And the way we deal with racist opinions. And what we should be more comfortable with doing is, rather than taking a punitive approach that person should be shunned from society and cancelled and never spoken to again, we should be of the opinion that we're willing to challenge ideas that we don't agree with in the public forum.
No, I've heard that, and I don't fully recognise the reality you describe, because if one thinks of somebody like Jeremy Clarkson or Boris Johnson, they can end up being the highest paid commentators in the country, and indeed Prime Minister, despite having fairly egregious incidents of, certainly in Johnson's case, obvious racism on his CV. So it doesn't appear to be any form of shunning or removal from society. So we're automatically talking about people on the left who need to hold themselves to higher standards if they're going to continue to hold the moral high ground when calling out people on the right for behaviour that is objectively wrong and objectively awful. I'm sad that we ran out of time, because I wanted to ask you a couple of other questions as well, Sasha. I hope you ring me again. It is 10:51 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Julie points out Braverman recently smeared Pakistani men as being uniquely likely to be paedophile groomers, using a provably inaccurate statement. Where was the widespread outrage? There was quite a lot of widespread outrage for that, but no, you're right, nothing like on the scale of what Diane Abbott has received. This is nice from Leah in Borehamwood, who speaks for quite a lot of my correspondence this morning, when she writes, Aisha was so inspiring and moved me to contact you, James. As a British Jew who's been extremely concerned with Diane Abbott's comments towards the Irish travellers and Jews, it gave my heart a warm hug, her showing that there is hope for us all to understand each other. And thank you for the kind words about my little show as well, Leah. And I read this as well. It's quite long, but I think it's helpful. I have a lot of respect for Diane Abbott, says Steve. She was the first female black MP. She's turned a majority of 8,000 into a majority of 30,000 in her constituency. If she was a bad MP, surely she wouldn't be getting that many people voting for her. From day one, she's had to endure the most awful racism, and this has got significantly worse since the advent of social media. Do Jewish, Irish heritage and Romani heritage MPs suffer the same level of abuse? I believe you have to walk a mile in another person's shoes to understand the way they look at the world. If you think this is suitable for Idiot's Corner, please place me on the Idiot's Corner naughty step. Keep up the good work. Again, Steve, if she'd made that point, then we wouldn't have a problem. But she didn't. She made the point that Jewish, Irish heritage and Romani heritage MPs wouldn't ever experience racism. Not that they experience differently or less virulently or less viciously, but that they don't experience at all. They experience prejudice, a bit like what redheads suffer. And that's it. There's no getting past this. I know that some people really, really want to, But that's what she wrote. You can't change the words that she wrote. It is true that many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice, but they are not all their lives subject to racism. In pre-civil rights America, Irish people, Jewish people and travellers were not required to sit at the back of the bus. No, but the Irish people, I mean, whether you want to go back to the potato famine or Oliver Cromwell, their race was a reason why they were murdered or starved. You don't need me to tell you about the Holocaust, which would have seen travellers and Irish people and Jewish people rounded up. It's just so silly what she said. And you may well think you know what she meant. In some ways, for someone, as one of the early callers, Chris, pointed out, for someone with her track record and her history to have missed so spectacularly is worse than it would be if it was a neophyte, if it was a relative newcomer to the House of Commons. I can't. I mean, I explained to you, I'm just looking at one of the people trying to bring this character accused of saying that all white men should have a black slave, a Tory councillor, and people saying, I've got my facts wrong, he's admitted it. He hasn't. This is his statement. I am aware of such serious allegations being made against me. This is why I have self-referred to the Public Services Ombudsman for an independent evaluation. It is now in the hands of legal experts and the Ombudsman. It would be unfair on the process for me to comment now. So if he had published that recording and it owned it, we'd be talking about it. Not as much as we're talking about the person who would have been Home Secretary if the last election had gone differently. But among the stupid things I encounter on social media, there's 3,000 likes for a tweet saying that we're all racists because we're not talking about this this Andrew, whatever his name is, character. And that is Andrew Edwards. That is frankly astonishing. But hey-ho, that's Twitter. Chris is in Nottingham. Chris, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, Chris.
Just want to say it's a pleasure to speak to you. You're a huge inspiration to me while I'm trying to make political art.
Thank you. What a lovely thing to say. Thank you.
The whole thing makes me very sad to start off with. I feel Diane Abbott has been subject to some appalling abuse over the years. But you can't disguise a puddle of vomit with a puddle of vomit.
Well, you probably can, actually. I don't know. Did you just invent that figure of speech?
Sorry, I meant to say excuse. You can't excuse a puddle of vomit with a puddle of vomit.
No.
I was a supporter of Corbyn's government. I voted for Corbyn's government, and I've been a supporter of Diane Abbott. But I thought that Keir Starmer was correct to expel Jeremy Corbyn. I think, and I think he was right to suspend Diane Abbott after this letter, because there should be a limit to a politician's credibility, and that limit is acts of racism, proven acts of racism. Her apology, you're right, is not enough. It's got echoes of Carlson when he wrote about Meghan Markle, basically saying, "Oh, draft, I didn't mean to send it. I sent it by mistake."
Yes, there are echoes.
It's the same echoes coming out. So you then can't really tell, does she mean her apology? I'm sure.
Well, we can't know that, and I think Sasha and you are making the point about. Actually, just to correct one thing she said, the High Court has ruled that suspensions can't be neutral. They are not neutral by definition, which is pertinent to the bigger picture. But we can't know that. But an investigation can't find that either. I mean, an investigation can never find anything, can it? 100% if it's a he said she said scenario. But I can't currently conjure up a conclusion that would let her off the hook, really, particularly now that we know it was sent twice, 3 hours apart, with a week before publication. That seems to me to be fairly crucial evidence.
I don't see a way back in for her.
No.
I really don't. I think it's gone over that threshold of credibility. I mean, will she win her seat if we come to a general election? Doesn't she have the largest Jewish community in Europe within her constituency?
In Stamford Hill, I think a couple of calls yesterday made that point. I don't know how much electoral.
A chunk of the electorate that's
but then we're back to where we started. I think you may have missed the very top of the show because I mentioned Clarkson. We're back to the principle versus pragmatism argument, because pragmatism, you could bring that electoral calculation into the picture, but if you were dealing solely in principle, would your answer be any different? I'm not sure mine would.
No, it wouldn't. That's not my reasoning for why.
No, I thought not.
She can't come back. She can't come back because she stepped over a line where she's no longer credible to certain people, to individuals who thought she may have held better values.
And it's a tragedy. That's why you talk about sadness, because it overshadows a lot of the good that she has done, a lot of the work that she has done.
The difficulty that she's had to undergo.
And that's why it is so awful. I mean, that is why it is so horrible to find yourself reluctantly on the same side of a fence as some of the most disgusting people in public life. But you've got to go with your own integrity. You've got to go. You can't turn your integrity down a few notches, because on this occasion, the obnoxious United are going through their stop clock being right twice a day moment.
Indeed.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for the kind words at the top as well. I'll read this from Janice. It came in quite early on. Sorry, James, I'm with Afua Hirsch on this. It was Afua's tweet about people, an undeniable bloodthirstiness to take down a black woman who's been enduring attacks since before I was born, that in many ways inspired this conversation. The absolute, almost total attack by practically all LBC radio hosts, many with thinly disguised glee over the last few days, has been awful to listen to. You can be better than this. I'm not taking that. I'll take a lot of criticism, but I am better than that. There's no thinly disguised glee here. There's a deep sense of sadness and a struggle not to start turning my integrity down, because I find myself on the same page as people not necessarily on LBC, but people in the business of commenting for a living who I find to be uniformly vile. It is 4 minutes after 11 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I was about to say then, I should write a book about all the times on the programme that you've said something to me that has completely changed the way that I look at stuff. And then I remember that I have. But I can't remember which of my two books, my two best-selling books. I can't remember which of my two. Don't roll your eyes, Keith. I'm counting. It's not an opinion. Which of my two books this story goes in? I think it went in the first one, but I can't remember why, because it should by rights have gone in the second one. It was a woman ringing in middle age, talking about when she'd been in her 20s, and she worked in a city law firm. And she told me, we were talking about being uncomfortable at work. Quite ahead of the game, actually, I think you'll allow. Long before the Me Too movement changed the way that we look at these sort of issues, one would hope forever. Just some breaking news for you. Joe Biden has announced that he will run for president in 2024. I say breaking news. It was Tom probably mentioned it in the bulletin, did he? But anyway, it's just popped up in front of me. So Joe Biden has announced his 2024 presidential run. And I think I saw a tweet from someone who I clocked, but I was busy concentrating on what the caller was saying. I clocked as being reliable. And it suggested that, what's his chops? Tucker Carlson just let go as a Fox News host, a particularly a virulent boil upon the backside of American politics for the last few years. That he might run as well, but that could have been a joke. I shall check. I mentioned the lawyer because it really stayed with me, and I didn't understand why. So I'm not a bad lad. I try to be good. I try to be decent, and sometimes I fail. And one of the things I've learned over the years is how little idea most chaps have of what it's actually like to be a woman, and one of the most obvious examples of that is the constant low-level sexual threat. And I remember this woman telling me what had happened to her. I have to say, I love the idea. I know that people who've been listening to this for a long time know exactly what story I'm going to tell, because I only have about 8. I'm very, very sparing with them these days. But we haven't done What Was It Like for a while, have we? But that's probably due a bit of a run out soon. But I tell you why this story stays with me so much, even though I can't remember all of the details. Because I felt my hackles, not my hackles, I felt my, what's the word you want when you're about to sort of interrupt and argue back? Don't say normal. I felt myself rising to the challenge, as it were. And all she said was this. She said, when I was in my 20s, I got in the lift. I was a junior member of staff. I think she was doing her articles at a law firm, a training contract. And she had to come in at the weekend and work with a partner. And she described the partner as being quite very mild-mannered, very not blokish or whatever word we would use these days. So not lecherous or just someone very much, like, wouldn't say boo to a goose type of partner, type of lawyer. And they were in a lift together on the weekend. No one else around really. They were working on his stuff. And he said to her, I love the way you fit. I really love the way you fill out those jeans, because it was the weekend. They were wearing casual clothes. And because she'd stressed how innocuous he was normally, how mild-mannered he was normally, I caught myself responding by, oh, he didn't mean anything. I don't think I actually said it out loud. In fact, you can tell whether I did or not, because I reproduced the full transcript in How to Be Right in a World Gone Wrong, or possibly How Not to Be Wrong, The Art of Changing Your Mind. I can't remember which one. And then I realised, or she explained to me, why that was so inappropriate. So now, if you're listening to this as a man or a woman, and you're thinking, oh, for God's sake, get over yourself, you snowflake, you need to pay attention, or you can carry on being an idiot for the rest of your life, which I would have done if I hadn't paid attention at this moment in my life. Because, of course, what the difference between saying you look great in those jeans, which is still not necessary, although we don't want to live in a world where compliments have been criminalised. You look great. You look lovely today. What a lovely frock, you might say. Something like that. But when he says, I love the way you fill out those jeans, he's not talking about her jeans, is he? He's talking about her body. And he's talking about her body in a lascivious way. It's a great word, that. And I, at the age of, 38 or something? I can't remember precisely when it was. But early middle age, had managed to get to that point in my life without realising what that was. I love the number of people who've just texted me who were previously unaware that Tucker Carlson had been let go by Fox News. That's fantastic. I didn't cross my mind you wouldn't know. But I'm delighted to what's the opposite of shooting the messenger? Buying him a pint, probably. I'd start laying them in. I'll be over at 1:30. So that for me was a really helpful example of a lesson that I needed to learn. And if you're new to the programme, you'll find this very, 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 very hard to believe. But I used to be one of those people that didn't think I had anything new to learn. I was pretty much an identikit wazzock for a phone-in host. Fat people should just eat less and exercise more. Stop and search is fine, because if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. And anyway, young black lads are more likely to be committing certain types of crime than other lads. Just the sort of your common garden ignorance. I never did motoring. I never did motoring issues. But apart from that, I was quite a large wazzock. And a big part of that, and you all know people in the UK media and indeed the American media who are very much like this. Sadly, it's a way of behaving that's hugely rewarded still in our media. It's why it's such a miracle that this programme has become the most popular in the genre. Turns out you don't have to be like that sort of tub-thumping meathead right-winger in order to get a big audience. But who knew, eh? Because when I started, I wasn't right-wing, but I was certainly a tub-thumping idiot. And a big part of that on-air personality is never being wrong. Never even acknowledging the possibility that you might be wrong. I can't admit that I'm absolutely right about everything. And it can lead people into ridiculous places, but such is the thickness of their fake skin that they pretend it hasn't hurt them or injured them at all. And on this occasion, for reasons I don't fully understand, my fake skin fell off. It was long before I started therapy, so it wasn't that. Something about the way the woman told the story, and I'll tell you what it was. The fact that it was so long ago. It was 20 or 30 years ago. This one incident, we must have got the question right that day on the programme, because it drove to the very heart of what we were talking about. And it made me realise that I will never know what it is like to be a woman, because not only am I never going to have somebody telling me in a lift that they love the way I fill out my jeans, but I'm also not going to experience anything like that against a backdrop of sexualised comments directed at me as a woman for my entire life. And the crucial point about why this was such a seminal moment for me was that in different circumstances, or if I'd got out of bed on a different side that morning, or if the woman hadn't been such a compelling caller to the programme, or if the gap between it happening and her still relating how upset it left her hadn't been so long or so big, I'd have argued with her. In fact, I may well have used that phrase, oh, I suppose you want to criminalise compliments, do you? And it stays with me, that conversation, because it was, if you like, my introduction to the sort of thing that I think the Labour Party are seeking to formalise in schools. The headline in the Times today is "Boys will learn respect for women under Labour." Boys would be taught how to respect women and girls as part of the national curriculum under Labour's plans to prevent laddish banter leading to misogyny and violence. It's a bid to bring about cultural change. They're going to go in hard on things like violence and abuse, where boys will hear firsthand from victims of it. But it will also embolden boys to call out friends who act in a misogynistic way. Keir Starmer said that by talking during school hours about how society treats women, the subject could become like mental health, with youngsters feeling much, much more comfortable discussing it than they did a decade ago. 13 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I don't think this is Idiot's Corner. Matthew wants to know, why no comment on Dom Lemon? Well, partly because he's so little known in this country, Matthew, that even you've got his name wrong. There's a CNN presenter called Don Lemon, who has also been let go by CNN for, I think, ratings-related reasons. But if you honestly think that is up there in the context of the madness that's engulfed America in recent years as the dismissal of Tucker Carlson, then let's just wait for my inbox filling up with people going, "Oh my God, Don Lemon's been fired." It will now, of course, because everyone's a comedian. And that for me is a really, really good idea. They were joined in London by Emily Attack, whose mum is usually listening, by the way, but she's been incredibly brave talking about her repeated sexual harassment online and IRL, and indeed her experience of sexual assault. And that astonishing woman, Georgia Harrison, the reality television star who campaigned against revenge porn and took her ex-boyfriend to court, all the way to court, culminating in his imprisonment. So we know where the extremities are, right? But what I'm interested in are I think the word might be microaggressions, I'm not sure, but the experiences like that woman had in a lift. So you can take a 40-year-old man, right, who thinks he's a feminist, who, how long ago? Yeah, who had 2 daughters and a wife at the time, so lives in a very feminine environment, and sees himself very much on the right side of these arguments about misogyny and harassment, and had rows on the radio with women saying that they liked having their bum pinched in the 50s because they thought it was a compliment, and me trying to explain why that was part of the problem, not part of the solution. John in Stockport said it was the fact that he'd obviously imagined her naked. This is the caller back in the day. He'd obviously imagined her naked that made her feel uncomfortable. And that's the difference between saying, "Oh, nice jeans," or even, "Oh, you look great in those jeans." But to say, "I love the way you fill out those jeans," just made a difference to this woman that I've never forgotten. And it seems like such an innocuous example, doesn't it, in the context of much worse things that happen every day to women around the world. But that was what got my little grey cells chugging away. And I want to try to come up with similar examples, really. So, listen, if I was still that guy who thinks that overweight people should just eat less and exercise more, and stop and search is fine, and if we can't get British people out of Sudan, it's got nothing to do with the Foreign Secretary, who I like, and everything to do with all the civil servants who I've never met, that kind of really, really lazy, knee-jerk, colour-by-numbers commentary or punditry. If I was still in that zone, I would now say to you, well, that's a load of rubbish. How are you going to be able to teach that sort of thing? Obviously, we all want boys to respect women, but it's not like teaching it. You might as well try and teach people how to push water uphill. Now, that's obviously Rolex, absolute Rolex. But let's at least treat it with a modicum of respect and explain what the actual difference is. Okay? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. So, boys will be taught how to respect women. Can you give me an example, give us an example of disrespect that at first glance is not outrageous? So the stuff, and this is going to sound so crazy to women listening, because they're going to be thinking, well, I might as well ring him and tell him that bears go to the toilet in the woods, or that the Pope is a Catholic. But I promise you, this is what this entire scheme is about. It's about the fact that men and boys have absolutely no idea about the simple reality of of what you might call low-level sexual aggression. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need, okay? And the question is this. When did you realise that boys and men do need to be taught respect for women? And, I mean, you can ring me with any example you want. Of course you can. But I think that the more powerful examples, perhaps, will be the less obviously wrong behaviours. Like the bloke in the lift who would have had absolutely no idea what he was doing to that young woman all those years ago. I love the way you fill out those jeans as opposed to, you look nice today. Fill out those jeans. It made me realise he was thinking about me naked. So what would you point to as something that happens to you every day or something that's only happened to you once as the reason why you know that boys and men, up to and including me, do need help, do need lessons in respect for women? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. And don't leave me hanging on this one because I'm now completely out of insights and input. So 0345 6060 973. And I'm going to tell you now, Paul in Swindon and Ollie in Kensington, do not ring me if you are a man. Okay? This shouldn't be hard to understand. Tim in Scunthorpe, do not ring me if you are a man because you, possibly unintentionally, maybe you want to know what the weather's going to be like next Thursday. You're kind of part of the problem, lads. All right? And I knew it was going to, so did you, right? Because every time we do a topic like this, up they come. Up they come, like unflushable poos. Absolutely incredible that you could hear an introduction like that. I think I'm going to ring in and put forward a bloke's point of view. It's 11:19. 22 minutes after 11, Luby's in Bradford. She says, about 10 years ago, when I was 18, I worked in a rock music nightclub behind the bar. My boss told me during my trial night that I'd need to be okay with, quotes, banter, end quotes, from the male bouncers and bosses. The, quotes, banter, end quotes in question was talking about my breasts and, on occasions, grabbing my bum. The irony being that if the bouncers saw a customer acting in this way, they would remove him. But they could all do it to me and call it banter. I don't know what to say about that. It's such a perfect example of part of the problem that we're discussing. And the problem we're discussing is the obvious necessity, despite the way it will stick in the craws of some men listening and even perhaps some women, of lessons in respectful behaviour by males towards females. Katie's in Croydon. Katie, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I wanted to just say a sort of anecdote from when I was in school. So it was about 10 years ago now when I was about 15, and we were all at a party and the boys had devised a plan where they were going to get loads of alcohol, which they did, get the girls really drunk, which would mean that the girls are going to engage in sexual activity with them. And we did. And then the school found out. And when that happened, the school vilified the girls. We were called sluts. We were shamed for what happened, and the boys had no repercussions. And I think that story sat with me and many of my friends who are involved in that till this day, because of the way the school dealt with it. And I think that's why it's really important that the school, they have training themselves in how they're actually meant to handle these situations, because the boys were the ones who didn't do anything wrong. It was
in the eyes of the school. So that sounds a bit like a boys will be boys type scenario, which is such a dangerous phrase.
Exactly. And it's the onus is on the girls to not get too drunk. And I think you have this even now. I'm very conscious when I go out and about. Don't drink too much. Because you put yourself in a vulnerable position. But the onus shouldn't be on just the girls to protect themselves. If the boys didn't have these attitudes, we wouldn't need to protect ourselves.
No, clearly, and I suppose in some way, I find him so bizarre and unpleasant. I'm loath to talk about him on the radio, but he does represent quite a large and burgeoning modern phenomenon. The suggestion that the confusion that boys feel, or the sense of perhaps even being treated as villains, explains why someone like Andrew Tate can come along and make such capital out of claiming that it's actually boys who are the real victims in these scenarios. You can see why that's so seductive, even though it's so obviously bogus.
But then the girls have felt like that for ages.
Correctly.
We're the villains.
Correctly.
Especially, when we look at how it is if a girl goes to the police and say that they've been assaulted or raped, and it's like, well, what were you wearing?
Yeah.
Were you drunk? We've been the villains for so long in these situations. It's always been our fault. It's our fault if it happens all the time. I've had plenty of times when I've been in a club and someone has touched me. And it's like, well, you shouldn't have worn a skirt that short. What do you expect? And I fight back against it. I'm more than happy. I'll push somebody up against the wall and say, don't touch me like that.
Sure.
But lots of girls can't, I think it's actually really scary. And I just wanted to share the anecdote because I think even parents probably don't know. They think that their boys wouldn't be like that, but they don't know.
Especially in a pack, when you're under peer pressure. And I wonder whether actually, you'd have to choose the language carefully. You'd have to absorb the pearl clutching and the bogus scaremongering from the Daily Mail. But Mick suggests teaching misogyny, you can barely start teaching it too early. Not separate classes for boys and girls, but just teaching whatever word would be more comprehensible to younger boys, or maybe use the word misogyny and explain what it means, but just let them know that these kind of habits and tropes are learned behaviour. They're not inherent. They're not natural. They're learned behaviour, and it leads to the sort of situations that you've described, where older boys think it's perfectly permissible to try to render girls drunk in order to assault them, I guess, and the school comes down on the side of the boys, because boys will be boys. Thank you, Katie. Jess is in Norfolk. Jess, what would you like to say?
Hi. I wanted to say thank you. First of all, it's a hard conversation, but it's such a powerful one to have, especially for victims of this sort of violence. It's so hard to find that voice. But yeah, so sadly, I was a victim of childhood sexual abuse. So growing up, it was actually the first time I sort of spoke out about it was to my parents, and it was the attitude of boys will be boys.
Really?
Of it happened, and it stopped when I came out about it, but it was very much let's brush it under the carpet, and you sort of take on that guilt yourself.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. So now, I was saying my first grown-up job was a medical secretary in a local GP surgery, and it was really hard to realise that women still face this every day, that walking into a doctor's surgery, when you walk in, it's a male GP, and you want to have those conversations, and you're patronised if you say, oh, I don't feel quite comfortable with this, or it was quite hard from my job's point of view that there's not a lot of knowledge of local charities that can support with this sort of behaviour. So it's nice to see some work being done around this. For example, I know in a new cohort of midwives at the UEA in Norwich, they have actually come to speak to a charity that I work with, the Rome Project in Breckland, and they are talking about how women can be empowered through talking about their experiences and just the attitudes of other people. Sorry, I don't really know what I'm going with.
Don't. You're doing brilliantly. Yeah. It's bringing it out of the shadows, and it's a shadow 100%. That women inhabit. Every woman knows about this, and until relatively recently, I hope I keep saying this more in expectation than hope, but even nice men or even decent men didn't have much of a clue about how commonplace and how normal it was, normalised it was to experience this sort of thing. And then, of course, when you put the detail in place, when you talk about the response that you got from your parents, which is awful, but you can totally understand or believe that happened because of the mores that society has in place. Right. That's it. And the behaviour in clubs in particular. Every bloke who's ever been to a club must know that either one of their mates has groped a girl on the dance floor or they've witnessed somebody else. And yet when you hear it described outside the club, you bridle at how outrageous it is. It's bizarre, but that's, I guess, what normalisation means, Jess.
Yeah, you're right. It is just as simple of a saying no sometimes when you're in that pack mentality, when you're showing off to your friends, when there's factors like alcohol involved. If you don't want to hear that word, it's almost like it's not there. Or even when someone's someone doesn't feel comfortable enough to say no. It's about reading that body language and
I don't know that you can. I don't know you can start too early, really, with this kind of thing. You'll get a couple of people queuing up to claim that you're robbing children of their innocence, but they're usually pretty weird individuals anyway who make that argument in most contexts. And if it's not going to be done by government, who is it going to be done by? Some people would say, well, the parents should be doing it. Answered, they're not. And even if some were, how are you going to deal with the kids whose parents aren't doing it, if not in school? So it's yet another example of where a civilised society takes up social and civil responsibilities, which means, of course, that Tufton Street will hate it. Thank you, Jess. 11:30 is the time. Thomas Watts has your headlines. It is 11:34, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where a conversation about why Keir Starmer and I think it was Yvette Cooper are right to bring in essentially respect lessons for boys to help them understand the early signs of and the wrongness of what would then develop into obviously an objectively misogynistic behaviour. And I don't know what the lessons would look like, but I suspect that a very good starting point is examples of what offends or upsets women. And speaking as a man in middle age, it is shocking how many of us don't really realise. So you will say something. I think we've already demonstrated this today, and we may respond by going, "Yeah, but that's just normal," or "That's just bad," or "There's no harm in it." And if we're doing that in our 40s and 50s, goodness knows how likely it is to be happening if you're in your teens or your 20s. Liv is in Norfolk as well. Liv, what would you like to say?
Hi, so I'm a high school student.
Hi,
so
Liv.
obviously
You've got permission off your parents, haven't you, to talk to me?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Cheers.
So I spend a lot of time around boys my age, and it's so obvious to me that there's such little understanding of what is offensive and what makes women uncomfortable. And I don't think it's always coming from a place of like genuine hate or sexism. I think it's just coming from a place of ignorance a lot of the time.
And normalisation, not realising that what they're doing is upsetting you or offending you.
Yeah, and it's just like so casual, like the way boys will talk about girls. I myself I can name so many girls, so many of my friends who have had these comments towards them, and just like it's so inappropriate and it's just so glossed over.
Commenting on their bodies and stuff like that, is it?
Yeah, and it's just something that's so normalised in the way boys talk.
Does anyone ever talk back? Do any of your friends ever say, wind your neck in, pal, that's bang out of order?
Yeah, but a lot of the time, just because it's so casual, it's well, what's the problem with it? Yeah. The issue isn't really seen.
Yes.
And I think that's why it's so important that we need to be teaching boys from a young age that the behaviour isn't all right. And I shouldn't have to go to school, and my friends shouldn't have to be going to school and feeling uncomfortable and scared of what they're going to be hearing from boys in school.
Does anything happen, Liv, to address this? Is there any form of lesson or group or instruction from adults towards these boys about what is and what is not acceptable behaviour or suitable behaviour?
A lot of the time we get the boys will be boys comments when girls report these things.
Right. So I'm thinking the teachers need the lessons perhaps as much as some of the boys do. Some of the teachers need the lessons as much as the boys do.
That's the thing. It starts with, I think, just education and letting people know what is going to make what is offensive and what is not all right to say, and it just comes from a place of respect that it isn't being taught.
And that is why I mean, in many ways, even though you probably could do a better job than me of coming up with what the curriculum would look like for a course like this, they've got to try. And some of the stuff would be really obvious. Don't talk about people's bodies ever. Really, it's not something I can ever imagine being acceptable. And what I get, I don't know whether you will be aware of this, Liv, but I will get texts from men saying things like, yes, but if you fancied the bloke who was saying that stuff, you wouldn't mind at all, which is also part of the problem, I think, because how is the world going to suffer if we all agree that we're not going to start making comments about each other's body parts in schools to start with, and then hopefully that would extend into other parts of life as well?
Exactly. It's just about basic respect, and there seems to be a lack of just basic respect.
And that's the word that's in the headline today. And you like these lads, right? I mean, when you talk about how they're not coming from a place of hatred or misogyny, they're not bad people. They're developing bad habits, and if those bad habits aren't nipped in the bud, they could become something worse.
Well, yeah, most of it. Yeah.
Some of them are idiots, right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Liv. I hope you call me again. That was really helpful for me. Rowan is in Southend. Rowan, what would you like to say?
Well, first of all, can I say, James, that Liv was incredibly brave calling in,
yes.
and it's people like Liv that we should be looking towards to get the shape of education in the years to come.
Oh.
And I do hope that they lean in and help their teachers understand what it is that their teachers need to know in order to teach the boys better, because I know from a first-hand experience what happens if you don't teach the boys better.
Go on.
So I used to be a teacher.
Right.
I taught from 2007-ish until 2013. And in my second full year of teaching, I was a tutor. So I had my own tutor group. There was one boy in this all-boys school that I taught at who turned around to me in front of his head of year, also a woman, and said, there is no argument that a woman can make that she will ever win because she's a female, not even female, a female. So
wow,
so it was pretty shocking for somebody who was brought up in a feminist household to hear the thought that I, as a woman, had no ability to actually win an argument with a 16-year-old boy. And even though I might have been in possession of better and strong facts. So as you can imagine, I raised this as a concern. We got his parents in. And his father proceeded to put his mother down in front of me and the head of his year.
Oh, gosh.
And when the pupil, repeated that behaviour by putting his mum down, calling her, quote unquote, silly female.
Really?
Yeah. I was speechless, and I had to create a very uncomfortable situation to even get him to listen to me, which was basically invoke his unfortunately recently deceased great uncle.
Right.
Say, is that the sort of behaviour that your uncle would have appreciated?
Yeah.
And he was like, no, miss, no. It's all right.
So he was reachable then, in a way that presumably his dad wouldn't have been at this point.
Well, it was. This was the funny thing. Reachable-ish.
Yes, of course.
Because he went off and did it again.
Yeah.
And I went off and I spoke to our school psychologist about it, and it basically boiled down to the fact that the relationship that he had with his father was only a positive one when he was exhibiting behaviour that his father appreciated. He wasn't able to. So
he gets approval from his dad when he makes the comments like that.
Yeah.
Of course.
And the only way that we're going to solve this is go right back to the beginning. Well, we have relationship education in its appropriate form from year one, age 5. We have to have respect education at that level. We have the mechanism. We have organisations like NSPCC, because peer-on-peer abuse is a thing.
Yeah.
Incorporate their style into the very early years teaching. I mean, the NSPCC gave us the Pantosaurus video. Like, we need to use that and those techniques to go and reach in at an early age to say,
how early?
Actually, this isn't right.
Yeah.
Let's do it from year 1 onwards, 5 years old. A 4-year-old, a 5-year-old can understand that pulling a girl's hair is not
he can copy
appropriate.
his dad. He can copy his dad in thinking that girls are playthings or inferior or something like that. I wonder how much bigotry comes down to parents. You know, I often wonder this because you look at people engaging in language or saying things that you find utterly repellent, and you think, how could you possibly think that's acceptable? And you realise you grew up in a house where it was not just acceptable, just acceptable, but encouraged
and rewarded.
And rewarded. That's crucial, isn't it? It really is.
Yeah. And specifically, the reverse behaviour is not rewarded, and it's when you withdraw the approval from the child if they don't exhibit that behaviour, or they specifically exhibit behaviour that counteracts that. Then
it's tough, though, isn't it?
Up to fail.
It's hugely difficult, which makes it all the more urgent that they get a handle on it as quickly as possible, because you're going to look at the. Very hard to teach a lad that they should disapprove of their dad and follow a completely different I mean, really hard, really, really hard, but you've got to try.
You have to, absolutely, and the earlier the better. I have to say, as a corollary to this, I have no idea what happened to the lad in question.
No.
He left my care at the end of his year 11, and I haven't seen or heard from him since. I have to say, thank goodness.
Why do you say thank goodness? Because you mean he hasn't got himself into any bother that you're aware of, or you're just glad that he hasn't crossed your path again?
The latter, unfortunately.
I'm
I
sorry to hear
understand
that.
he may have got himself into some trouble unrelated to misogyny, but it's not something that...
No, there are cross sections here. I think there are Venn diagrams, and if you're behaving or you're being encouraged to behave in toxic ways in one context, it's presumably a lot easier to fall into toxic patterns of behaviour in other contexts as well. Thank you, Rowan. That was remarkable. Actually, I think I've got two very interesting guests coming up next, including Sebastian Lai, the son of Hong Kong entrepreneur and media owner Jimmy Lai, who has been imprisoned, and largely ignored by the British Prime Minister or the British government. There's an echo here of you can work out what the echoes are. So we're going to meet him and the barrister leading the international team for Sebastian's dad as well, Keelan Gallagher, after this. And then, as things stand, looking at my switchboard, I think we'll return to this territory at least for some time after 12. The time now is 11:45. 11:49 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Not a widely reported story from the all-party parliamentary group on Hong Kong yesterday, where they called for sanctions against the government over the jailing of Jimmy Lai, the publisher of Apple Daily. I've just been handed by Jimmy's son Sebastian a poster that, I mean, for anyone who even has the vaguest pretensions to journalism, it sends a shiver down the spine. In prison for printing the truth. I'm joined in the studio by Sebastian and by Keelan Gallagher, the barrister leading the international team for Jimmy. I'll start with you, if I may, Sebastian. I know, for example, that you can't join these calls for sanctions because that is a criminalised act in Hong Kong at the moment, but you can tell me what your dad did that has upset the authorities.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for having us here. My father was the founder and publisher of Apple Daily and Next Magazine, which was a pro-democracy newspaper in Hong Kong for the last 20-odd, 30 years. And for that, he is basically in jail now.
Were there specific articles that were published that caused this intervention, or is it just the general history of pro-democracy campaigning?
That's the scary thing with the current legal climate. It really is just the direction of where the newspaper was. The fact that they were pro-democracy, pro-free speech, that meant that my father and his colleagues are now in prison.
Your dad's a British citizen.
Yep.
Which you might expect to put a slightly different complexion on proceedings. As things stand, it hasn't.
Yeah, he escaped China when he was 12 and landed in Hong Kong, and which was obviously a British colony. And since then, he's earned his British citizenship. And
Keelan, the national security law in 2020 is a pivotal point in what has happened to Sebastian's father, I think.
Very much so. So Jimmy Lai's a remarkable man. He's in prison for his journalism, in prison for his writing, and in prison for being a peaceful pro-democracy campaigner. And the authorities targeted him for many years. And if I may say, James, Jimmy Lai, as a very successful businessman in the clothing industry in Hong Kong, having arrived in Hong Kong as a child with absolutely nothing, as an unaccompanied minor, he built it up, had a very successful clothing business. You might have heard of the name Giordano clothes, which were his. And Tiananmen Square in 1989 really changed him because he saw what was happening, saw the human rights abuses and felt he had to do something and he had to speak truth to power. And that's the year when he decided to found a media company. So his media company, founded in 1990, months after Tiananmen Square, from the outset was pro-human rights, pro-democracy, anti-corruption. And right from the start, he trod on powerful toes, something not unfamiliar to you, of course, and to any other journalist listening. He immediately started writing articles critical of leaders in Beijing, particularly China's then Prime Minister, the late Li Peng, the butcher of Beijing, and he was immediately targeted. So for decades he was targeted for his journalism and his writing and what his newspaper was publishing. But it's only in the last 3 years that the law has been weaponised against him. So Sebastian and his family had many years of their advertisers being targeted, home and business being firebombed for their work, a whole series of attacks. But what's now happened is he's essentially the victim of lawfare. Look, I act for Maria Ressa, the Nobel Peace Prize winning journalist in the Philippines. She's also a victim of lawfare, weaponising the law against journalists. It's also what we see in Russia, for example, Saudi Arabia. So it's people trying to slur journalists, say these aren't people to be trusted. And the national security law is what allowed them to do that.
I spoke to Chris Patton about this, not about this case, but about the optimism with regard to the handover. And there was a sense that Hong Kong might achieve some sort of unique status. But with each passing year, it's become more, what would the word be, China-fied?
Very much so.
And the passing of the national security law being a very important milestone on that path. Sebastian, how is your dad? Do you know? Can you? I mean, just in terms of this, because he's 75 years old, and there are grim lines which must really resonate. They must break your heart when you read in an otherwise very dry news report that he will probably spend the rest of his life in jail.
Yeah. So obviously, it's quite tough. I haven't seen him since he was arrested at the end of 2020.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. And it's basically one of the results of me speaking out on his behalf and bringing attention to his case is that I can't go back to Hong Kong. So optimistic that hopefully I'll see him one day, but there is definitely the risk of him spending the rest of his life in jail.
And what's the legal case, Keelan? What's the end goal, as it were?
Of course. So our key focus is trying to get him freed. So he already has served sentences for entirely peaceful pro-democracy activities. So he, until September last year, was serving sentences of over a year for completely peaceful things. Let me give you one example, James. He got a 13-month sentence for attending a vigil on the 4th of June 2020 in honour of the Tiananmen Square victims, lighting a candle, saying a prayer, being present for 15 minutes. He got a 13-month sentence. This is a British man receiving a sentence like that for a completely peaceful action at a vigil, and the UK government had nothing to say about it. He's already served those sentences. In September of this year, he's now facing a maximum of life in prison under the national security law.
No jury, of course.
No jury, and a minimum of 10 years for the crimes with which he's charged. And these are crimes about his journalism. The crime, allegedly, is that he published articles which were pro-democracy, pro-human rights, and criticised the authorities. So stuff journalists do here in the UK every day. And also, this is a British man who could have got out at any time, but stayed put to stand up and speak truth to power. And it's why we now need to speak out for him.
And what messages are you receiving from the British government, which, we all know what it says on the front page of our passport? We could be expecting a degree of support or at least interest.
We've been very disappointed.
Really?
So there was radio silence for a period of 2 years. Nothing said at all between December 2020 when he was arrested and December 2022. And that's very disappointing. He's a British man. Sebastian is, of course, a British man. Their family are British. And they expect that when something like this happens, their government is in their corner, but it isn't. And it's a contrast, stark contrast, to how outspoken the US government has been and the European Union has been. And I'm ashamed to say EU and the US have been stronger on this case than the UK.
You're not Irish?
I'm Irish.
So you don't need to be ashamed of that, then, do you?
Well, exactly. That's true. That's true.
But we can be, Sebastian. Yeah. We can be deeply disappointed. And James Cleverly, of course, today, I think, due to give a speech which is being widely regarded as relatively warm in its approach to China. That perhaps is a conversation for a different day. Does he have a barrister? Because I know they tried to ban Tim Owen, a British barrister, from representing him in.
Yeah, that's right. So for reasons linked to the national security law, the international legal team and the domestic legal team are completely separate, because we know that many lawyers in Hong Kong have been targeted also by the authorities, and we've been threatened by the authorities, and Sebastian's been threatened by the authorities simply for going to the United Nations. At the moment, he is prevented currently from having access to his lawyer of choice on his domestic team. But to be honest, we also think this is a bit of a red herring. Of course he should have access to the lawyer of his choice. But the bottom line is he's being prosecuted under a law which has been internationally condemned as being unfair, which criminalises just the most basic act of criticising authorities.
Literally
and he faces
criticising authority.
Exactly. And he faces a life sentence for that. It's only a few weeks since they arrested 2 people under the national security law for the act of owning books, not even distributing books, just having books.
Briefly, what could the government do? What could the UK government do? What do you want them to do?
So, at the moment, they have yet to ask for my father's release,
right?
Which I think is it's a very basic
starting point, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, and they have yet to condemn the legal cases that was brought forward to my father, including the one that Keelan mentioned of him lighting a vigil, a candle at a Tiananmen Square vigil.
So it's quite straightforward, really, in terms of what an intervention could look like. We're going to run out of time. I'll find more time to squeeze you in before the end, Keelan. But before we do that, could you tell me a bit about your dad, Sebastian? What kind of man is he? What kind of dad is he?
I had a very happy childhood. He always told me that. He was a man that led by example, and obviously what he's doing now, though I am very worried about him and very sad about him, it's also very awe-inspiring because it is someone who is standing up for his principle, even when every single thing that he's built is at stake. And for that, I'm obviously very worried about him, but also I respect him a lot.
Do you ever wish he didn't?
I think it's obviously I wish I could see my father. I just recently got married. I wish he was there for my wedding as well. But I think there's a few times in life where you get put with these decisions of whether you sort of stand up to what you believe in, or duck essentially and put your head down. And I don't think he'd be able to live with himself. I don't think he's the type of person that would duck. And though I wish he was here with me, yes. I'm also very understanding of why he did what he did, or what he's doing, what he's doing. Yeah.
Keelan, last word to you.
Yeah, well, I think I'd like to give the last word to Jimmy himself, who gave an interview in 2019 to the New York Times. And at the time, a lot of businesses in Hong Kong, a lot of business people were making empty statements against the pro-democracy protesters because they were under pressure to do so. And he said he understood why they were doing it, but it was a mistake because China's leaders know that once they cow you, they can always cow you. Once they have you in their pocket, they will always squeeze you. And this is certainly a man who's not been cowed. He's not in the authorities' pocket. He, in Hong Kong, stood up for others, and now we have got to stand up for him.
Wow. Thank you. Sebastian Lai, son of the imprisoned journalist Jimmy Lai, and Keelan Gallagher, KC, a barrister at the Doughty Street Chambers who's leading the international team for Jimmy, also acting for Sebastian. Thank you for your time, and let me know, won't you, if there's anything else we can do. It's not the biggest platform in the country, but it's yours if you ever need it.
Well, thank you so much.
It's 12:01. 4 minutes after 12 is the time. Important conversation there, as you can tell. I mean, it shook me slightly, that idea of being sent to jail for journalism is in prison for printing the truth. Find out more about Jimmy Lai, spelled L-A-I, and possibly even bring some pressure to bear upon the politician in your life. I'm going to take, if you're quick, I want to take a couple more calls on the question about respect lessons. And then I want to move on to something completely different. I've waited until the final hour of the programme for this because I wanted America to have a better chance to wake up. I'm interested, really, now that Tucker Carlson has been handed his sandwiches wrapped in a roadmap. I mean, how many people listening to this go, who? Tucker who? Was he in Grange Hill? It wasn't Carlson, but Tucker Steb script. It's more than that. The thing is that a presenter on Fox News who endorsed Donald Trump's lies about the last election while knowing they were lies. This is what emerged in this remarkable legal case with Dominion voting systems, where emails from within the hierarchies at Fox News were handed over to the court or to the prosecution lawyers. And it emerged, no great surprise, really. What's the surprise is that it emerged, is that they all knew it was Rolex. So they all knew it was nonsense, even as they were selling it gift wrapped with a lovely fluffy bow to their viewers. And of course, normalising Donald Trump or failing to scrutinise Donald Trump has been a hugely significant and international story. So you might say, so what? A television presenter has been sacked, has been fired. But if you think of Tucker Carlson as one of the key architects of an ecosystem in which Donald Trump could contemplate launching an armed coup against the elected government of the United States of America, then you understand the significance of his biggest cheerleader in the US media and of Fox News in general. So that's what I want to talk about. What I want you to do, if you're familiar with American media, is to tell me what it's done. What has Tucker Carlson done to America? Or to your dad, or your Uncle Bob, or your Uncle Hank? That's what I really want to know. And we'll open that up, I think, after 1:15 or possibly 1:30. But I'm just very interested in what he has done. Because for a television presenter's dismissal to make the news on the BBC on the other side of the Atlantic, I don't know how stuff like this gets reported outside the English-speaking world. But I mean, it's staggering, really. It's fair to say that when I get my sandwiches wrapped in a roadmap, they're not going to be they're not going to be going big with it on the American news. So it is an astonishing phenomenon. And although I'm conscious of being in the media and therefore perhaps more interested in the media than you are, that's the point about the architect. The building is so important. The building being the toxicity of American politics, the weaponization of lies, the attempted assault, really, upon the Capitol on January the 6th. All of that is the building. And if you recognise the importance and the size of the building, then it's obvious why you should be talking about the architect. In this case, Tucker Carlson. So we'll open up those phone lines shortly. Before that, back to the question of teaching boys respect and perhaps the difficulty that some people of a certain age perhaps have in understanding, A, why this is so important, and B, why it needs to happen. Emma is in Brighton. Emma, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James.
Hello.
I'm the mother of 3 girls, 2 in senior school and 1 in primary. And when my eldest was 11 at primary, a small boy kept touching her bottom in the playground. And when she went to report it, she was told to just come back if he does it again.
Really?
And it wasn't until about a couple of days later that my daughter told me about this. And what worried me so much about it wasn't what the boy had done, but A, that the teacher had done nothing, B, that when my daughter had reported it, she hadn't been listened to, and C, when I spoke to my friends about this, because I was so staggered by it, just how polarising this actual topic was.
Go on.
In terms of, shall we have a look at the boy? You know, what was the intent there? Was it sexual? Now, don't get me wrong, I wasn't looking for the boy to be arrested, but I think it is very black and white to me.
It's her
just
bottom.
Have a conversation. It's her bottom.
Yeah.
Have a conversation between what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, and just no one was doing that, and I just found that really, really disconcerting. And as I say, because even my mum friends were just like, I think that's all right. He's only 11 years old.
But that doesn't. You say even my mum's friends, which immediately gives away the fact that you didn't grow up in Brighton. You grew up somewhere near where I grew up, I think. Did you? Yeah, thought so. So even when you say even my mum's friends, I would expect it from your mum's friends. I would expect it from the older generation because they have been conditioned to accommodate this kind of behaviour from men and boys over generations. But from your own peer group, for your own generation, I'd find it more shocking.
And I think the fact was my daughter found it shocking.
Yeah.
That was the main point. She was the one that reported it, and she wasn't listened to. So what are we teaching our young children when they do report things, even if they're seemingly minor? You know, if they're brushed under the carpet and said, "Oh, you know, he didn't mean it."
Well, that's it, isn't it? That's exactly it. That's exactly why it is something that needs to be on the curriculum. You'd obviously done something right, though. A, that your daughter knew it was wrong, and B, that she came to you with it.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Yeah,
well, it's clear.
But I think what we and the other thing I should say is that my friend was actually said to me, I feel very sorry for these young boys at school today because, you know, all these mothers that take things totally out of...
Whoa, your friend said that to you?
Yeah, and I couldn't... And this is a feminist, you know...
She didn't have daughters. She didn't have daughters.
She's got 2 daughters.
Oh, no, there goes my world-famous scalpel analysis of current affairs. No.
But her immediate thought of her mother was, oh, what if someone accused my boy of that kind of behaviour?
Yeah. Okay. Is that someone at the door?
It is someone at the door.
Well, that's just in time. Look at that. You've brought it in bang on time, Emma. I will detain you no longer. That's strong stuff. And I sense from your tone and the way we've had this conversation that it didn't do your daughter lasting damage, but it shifts the needle. It recalibrates the needle of what is normal and what is acceptable when you take something like that to the school and the school seek to brush it under the carpet. It's so important, this conversation, because it's stuff, and I very much stressed repeatedly that I would have needed this. Still do. Goodness knows if no one's a finished article, but I do understand the resistance to it. Why a mother would do it, Emma's just unpicked beautifully. It's because she's worried that her boy might, who she knows doesn't mean any harm by it, but if he touched a girl's bottom or pinched a girl's bottom in school, we wouldn't want the Spanish Inquisition to turn up. But no, you shouldn't be doing the conversation from the perspective of the poor lad who's ended up in bother by dint of doing something wrong, even though he's not a wrong 'un. That should be coming from, why are they still doing stuff that's wrong? What are we missing? Where is the communication failure here? Where is the communication breakdown? Frankie's in Bradford. Frankie, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I just wanted to pick up on your comments about when is the best time to start talking about it. One of the things that I'm really passionate about, I have a little girl. She's 2 and a bit. But I will never, ever force her to give Grandma a kiss goodbye. And I think it's really important, not just for girls, but almost especially for boys, that from day one, they are never told that someone else wanting something from them is more important than what they want to do with their body.
Yes.
Even if it's just something as it sounds
as relatively
so
innocuous as giving Grandma a kiss. I think the key word is forced, not kiss, isn't it? It's because I mean I've seen it in adverts. It's been a comic trope for decades when you know. Grandma's got a hairy wart and false teeth, and the kid, it's almost a punishment for this. So, you know, we do make jokes about forcing children to kiss adults, and when you introduce Grandma to the equation, it automatically sounds, at first glance, it sounds a bit excessive on your part. But it's the notion of coercion. It's the notion of, here is a scenario, which I'm watching from the outside, in which it's perfectly acceptable to force that young child to kiss an adult they don't want to kiss.
Yeah. And I do it even with me. I say to her at bedtime, can I have a kiss goodnight? And if she says no, I'll say, okay, can I have a cuddle? And if she says no to that, then you do high five. Yeah. Or, you know, but if she says no to something to do with her body, that's it.
So you're teaching her consent.
We don't even act like we're disappointed.
No,
we just
can't.
say, okay, that's your body.
Well, it's a bit hard sometimes not to be a bit disappointed.
Obviously.
You really want a cuddle.
But
a cuddle's a cuddle.
You don't show it to
her.
her.
No, of course not. And so you're teaching consent, which again sounds, you know, highfalutin or serious, but it's break it down into what it is, and it's a straightforward issue and a perfectly sensible one. Indeed, an important one.
It's teaching her that nobody has a right to her body, and she's the one that gets to decide what happens to her body.
Also, I mean, Grandma probably doesn't want a kiss from a kid who's had to be frog marched into the room to do it.
I don't know.
No, it's actually, I think I'm completely misunderstanding grandmas. Thank you, Frankie. So you see, you can have these conversations in a way that is simultaneously warm and light, but deep and serious at the same time. And that is, I guess, the challenge that would face any sort of curriculum-based introduction of teaching how to respect women. But my goodness me, I'm not sure I would have taken a call from someone saying we don't need to do it, because we all know exactly where he would have been coming from. Why on earth wouldn't you want boys to be taught how to respect women? I think I'll leave that one hanging. 18 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we'll come back to that. It's really interesting that I'm going to keep that story and keep an eye on that. And next time we get a chance to talk to Yvette Cooper or Keir Starmer, will you remind me to ask them how that is progressing? Because if they do win the next election, you kind of want that kind of thing to hit the ground running, don't you? Rather than sit there waiting for days or years or months of consultation. I don't think I need to do an introduction on this. It's up to you, really. I've already got 3 or 4 calls waiting to talk to me about Tucker Carlson, who sounded like Shaka Khan, that, didn't it? Who is a hideous creation, really, who doesn't even believe what he says on air. I haven't got the numbers in front of me for Fox News, but its influence far exceeds its audience. But I do remember taking calls. I read an article. I think this was before Donald Trump became president. I read in fact, as Gary pointed out, the last hour, that's where locker room talk comes from. When grown men are trying to excuse the kind of vileness that is under discussion here, that's where I think it was Farage, wasn't it, who described Donald Trump's description of sexually assaulting women routinely on a regular basis. He described it as locker room talk. In fact, oddly, it ties in. We can bring Farage into the first hour as well, because his comfort hanging around with profoundly anti-Semitic people doesn't seem to have ever presented question time from giving him a season ticket, or I think he's still got a job in broadcasting, has he? It's quite hard to keep up. But talk about the Jewish lobby and stuff like that, and way worse than anything Diane Abbott has done. But hey-ho, horses for courses, I guess. I remember talking about Fox News, and I can't remember whether I read it or whether someone told me that we talked about family breakdown as a consequence of Brexit. I remember some reading or hearing of someone who'd gone to visit their parents who'd recently subscribed to Fox News or recently started watching Fox News, and after about 6 months they'd buried the family jewels and their guns in the back garden because they'd learned from Fox News that Barack Obama was going to come to their house personally and take them away, which was probably an embellishment or an exaggeration, but it remains a fascinating question. So how significant, how virulent, how bad has Tucker Carlson been for America? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I talked to Mehdi Hassan, who's also now a prominent broadcaster in America. He used to work for the New Statesman in this country. Very bright fellow. I talked to him about this, about the question of who's worse, the ones that are lying or the ones that actually believe the nonsense that they spout. I think we talked about it with reference to Marjorie Taylor Greene, who you may be familiar with as well. And the ones that are lying have to be worse, don't they? The ones that are saying stuff they know not to be true because there is reward in it. There are rewards to be had as a consequence. Surely that's the... Anyway, let's find out. How bad has he been? Let's start with Lisa, who's in Southampton, and then Gay, and then it could be you. And then Neil, and then Gay, and then it could be you. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And I don't just want media analysis, although there's plenty of room for that. I would quite like stories. What's it done to your dad? 034, your Uncle Keith. 0345, sorry, Uncle Hank. 0345 60. Shall I say the number? No, I won't bother. Lisa's in Southampton. Lisa, what would you like to say?
Yeah, obviously I'm American.
Well, you say obviously. We've only heard...
Show.
Yes, carry on. Thank you.
No, but I've seen what had happened with my sister-in-law's family in California. They during the pandemic... she didn't see her family for 2 years because they had gone down the rabbit hole of Fox News. They used to be mainstream Republicans, and then they went...
So that would be Ronald Reagan, George Bush.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Ronald Reagan, George Bush. But this phenomena of Fox News coupled with Trump, coupled with... it just literally... she didn't see her family for 2 years because of the differences, the political differences. I mean, I remember Fox News was here until 2017.
Yes, that's right.
And then I watched them during the Iraq War. Their take on what was happening was totally different than the BBC.
Sure.
It's always been right-wing, but it was more like Rush Limbaugh right-wing.
Okay.
Now it's gone into a whole new thing.
Well, you need to explain that, because, I mean, for my money, Rush Limbaugh was pretty appalling. Anyway,
he was pretty appalling,
what was the new gear that they found with people like Tucker Carlson, and I think with Sean Hannity as well?
Well, I think it's just basically, it was just the conquer and divide and conquer. They literally thought, and I think all of our news outlets are to a certain extent. It is more, it's populism, and they saw how it worked around the world, and they thought it. And then I think they took that tack, and people were ready for something new. And this is where, I mean, obviously, I'm on the other side of the spectrum. I watch MSNBC and CNN, but even CNN has come much more to the right, and I can see Fox News is going to have to go a little bit more central. because they're going to lose their viewers will be going to Newsmax and places like that.
Which is, I mean, this is the Overton window that's moving, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
It moves to the right, and the rest of the world moves with it because you shift the parameters of what is and is not acceptable. And it's got the full thing. I mean, the Great Replacement theory, all of these deeply racist cultural Marxism, a very anti-Semitic invention. All of these things became common parlance, I think, on his programs.
But also, I think the thing is he could get away with it that long. That would always amaze me, whereas CNN has just sacked Don Lemon, who's one of my favorite presenters, for some really awful comments he did make.
What did he do?
Terrible.
What did he say? Sorry, I've missed that. I thought it was ratings for Don Lemon. I'm glad you're here.
No, it's because it was in February he made a comment with his two female presenters. I watch it every morning, this morning, and he said that Nikki Haley was past her prime.
Oh, dear.
And,
well, that ties in with the last hour in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that was very derogative. And then his two female presenters said, "What do you actually mean about that?"
Yeah.
He said, "Well, women in their 20s and 30s, but once you get into your 40s," and that's why they sacked him.
What an idiot!
It was an idiot, but CNN sacked him, whereas Tucker Carlson got away with this stuff for
a million
years.
times worse. Well, then, oddly enough, then we're back to the first hour in the way that Diane Abbott is being held to a much, much higher standard than people on the right ever hold their own people to.
And that's
look at that. You've gone tri-topical with your first contribution. Here's the thing I don't get, and I'm obviously going to introduce a little bit of a boast here because it's been at least half an hour since the last one. But Fox News registers about 1.3 million weekly viewers, right? That's the total, 1.3 million weekly viewers in a country of 332 million.
Yeah,
I get those sort of numbers on this single radio show. So how does Fox exercise so much influence?
Yeah, because a lot of people watch it on, it's not just like they don't tune into it. A lot of people watch it on clips, YouTube, TikTok. But I have to say, I understand why you get such high ratings because you are absolutely my favorite host.
Well, you're very kind. Could you put a word in for me? These $20 million a year contracts that they get in America and the rest of it, I could probably find room for some of that. Thank you. And actually, before you go, how bad did your sister-in-law's family get?
Well, they didn't get vaccinated. They didn't get vaccinated. They didn't wear masks. They had a wedding for 200 people during the pandemic. Which she couldn't go to. It was a family wedding, and she said, "There's no way I'm going," and I didn't blame her. And they're not even they're Democrats, but I would say they're soft Democrats. They're fiscally conservative and Democrat as far as human rights. So they're really in the middle. They're the type of voter that Biden. They voted for Biden, and.
Okay.
But yeah, they're not. But the other side of the family, and that was sad for me to see.
And it is,
really
you lose
lovely.
sight. Yeah, I mean it's a rabbit hole, and you can't follow them down it, and you can't reach them once they're near the bottom of it. Thank you, Lisa. Heather is in Manchester. Heather, what can you tell us?
Hiya, first-time caller. A little bit nervous, just so you're aware.
Well, don't be, because you've already charmed me. Because you're American originally, but you've got the Mancunian higher off pat now. So that was just lovely. That was just hiya.
Brilliant. Well, no, just following on from your previous caller, I had a similar experience where my kids and I moved over here, and we're not necessarily massively liberal, but we're not Trumpians either. But family back in the States are gung-ho Trump to this day, and they see Carlson resigning as furthering the conspiracy. So really they see that more as proof that the voter fraud is real because, well, if he's left, then clearly he knows something, and Fox is in with the Democrats.
How? So eventually they'll start eating each other. The children of the revolution will start eating each other. I think I just made that up. I don't think that's a figure of speech.
No, you're absolutely right, actually, because my second oldest moved back to Texas when he was 18 because the Home Office are not my friends. They said, "You're an adult, you must leave the UK." And
delightful.
But because of that, he's lived with grandparents who are as conservative, stereotypical Trumpians as you can get.
Yes.
And they've actually convinced him, even though he's high risk, he didn't get vaccinated.
Oh, God.
They don't wear masks. His grandmother passed from catching COVID, and they still don't believe it.
And this comes from Fox, does it? This is because you're the second caller in it. Because I didn't pick on that. I went more for the January the 6th stuff and the lies about the election, but anti-mask vaccine skepticism.
Yeah, well, it's kind of all inclusive.
No,
really.
I get that. I get that.
Yeah.
Good Lord.
But he doesn't speak to his siblings that live here.
Oh no. Heather, I'm sorry.
Oh no, it just shows kind of the power that. Apologies, I know you're part of the media, but the wider media, shall we say?
There's media and there's media. Come on.
Yes, we'll say the American media, the American right-wing media.
Oh, Fox News in particular, with this new Newsmax coming up on the outside lane, even more extreme.
Is that not just kind of the US version of GB News?
I don't know. I don't watch it enough to comment on that. It certainly doesn't have anything like the influence that Fox News has, and it's populated largely by clowns, I think, the last time I checked.
You know, I remember growing up, you didn't watch CNN because it was full of conspiracies. Fox was the only way to get the true story because they fact-checked. And this was decades ago. This is a long time ago.
They swung it around completely in the
really
opposite direction.
Just swung the other way. And they've got whole towns that, follow Fox News. And if you say a word against Fox News, then you're the devil.
And that is astonishing. So now the defenestration of Tucker Carlson, even after the publication of those emails that showed that he knew he was lying, knew his guest was lying. What was the name of that lawyer, Heather? Can you remember? Sydney someone?
Oh gosh, I can't.
One of Trump's lawyers. He used fairly, clear language on Sidney Powell. There you go. But now he becomes evidence of the con that he's helped to sell. It's so hard to keep up. I don't know how they do it. And as ever, as we prove on this program on a regular basis, you pull the tiniest thread on these conspiracy theories and the whole thing falls apart. And they never thank you for it. They just get angrier with you than they were before. Thank you, Heather. I hope things improve with your lads soon. That must be tough for you. Amelia Cox is here now with the headlines. It is 12:35. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. That's two American callers, both with very close to home tales of the damage that Fox News in general, or Tucker Carlson in particular, can do to a family. I felt that the second lady in particular, talking about her son going back to America at the age of 18 and essentially falling down a very ugly rabbit hole. And that fascinating new development, that the dismissal of Tucker Carlson. And I spoke to a couple of people today who know Rupert Murdoch of old, and the suggestion that it would have been a requirement of the legal case from Dominion was poo-pooed by them. This very much the sort of emperor has turned his thumb downwards in the Colosseum, and Tucker Carlson, despite being the top-rated presenter on the station, actually, Keith, you should probably write that down. So despite being the top-rated presenter on the station, he got handed his sandwiches wrapped in a road map. So no complacency here, lads. All right, just despite being the top-rated program on the station, nobody is indispensable. Nobody is sacred. I think it's Rachel's next week as well, so I probably won't be the top-rated program on the station any longer. So I'll be even less indispensable than I am now. But just to British media, and I don't think the comparisons with some of the, although the conspiracy theories are popping up on one of those new channels, I'm afraid I get very confused about who's where and what's what. But certainly there's a friend of mine called Dr. Matthew Sweet has done some astonishing work looking at some of the conspiracy theories being punted by some of the presenters on these news channels. But I don't think anybody takes them seriously enough for them to be compared to Fox News. But be careful. Who knows what will creep around on the outside. Let's go to Kieran, who is in Holmes Chapel in Cheshire. Kieran, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, hello, James.
Hello.
Well, really, I've been following politics for a long, long time. I do enjoy politics. I especially like American politics. So when Trump became president, was probably one of our darkest days in history, personally. And the damage that he's managed to do in the last 8 years is incredible. And I say 8 because running up to the presidency, during the presidency, and the MAGA forming of what he does, but more so because of Fox, how they've enabled him. And Rupert Murdoch knows exactly what he's doing. Of course he does.
No, it's business for him.
Absolutely. You know, it's money in the pocket. You know, he had a line directly to the White House when Trump was there. So Tucker Carlson is...
Although he obviously held Trump in contempt. That was something else that came out from the text.
Absolutely, but it still comes down to the money, James.
We're not about red and blue, we're about green, I think he said, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. So when Tucker was kicked off yesterday, I actually wasn't surprised because of how Rupert Murdoch works. I did a little dance around the kitchen, I'll be honest with you.
Yes.
However, within hours, as you've been saying, the conspiracy theories of what's going on and what's happening, it all started to unravel. And, of course, then they were talking about John Lemon going on CNN, etc., using the yin and yang of that sort of position. However, I go back to the point of the last 8 years. Whilst it terrifies me what's happening in America, and I have friends who go, why are you so bothered? Why are you so interested? But because whatever happens on that world stage in America does affect the world. Look how it's influenced the UK, for example, and how the UK Conservative government.
Well, I've seen conservative. I think I've seen conservative politicians use the phrase cultural Marxism, haven't I? Whereas
you have indeed.
And that's an anti-Semitic trope right up there with puppet masters and the rest of it. The way Farage talks about George Soros, the way he flies over to Fox News to get his tummy tickled or to do whatever it is that he does for Donald Trump. We've never been entirely clear, but it has leached over the Atlantic, hasn't it?
Absolutely. But the point I'm trying to make really now, and apologies, I've gone around my hat a little bit, is the MAGA movement is actually quite small. It's very, very loud, and it's the loudest voice. But it's the loudest voice because not only did Fox actually portray them and give them bells and whistles, but the other big news stations do the same. The only way this stops is if they stop giving them a platform. So your Marjorie Taylor Greens, your Carrie Lakes, etc. There's rumours that Trump's going to have.
You really are plugged into it all, aren't you?
Oh, I know it all, inside and out, honestly.
You're just hypnotised by it, or is there another reason?
I'm just really, really interested because of the damage that's been done. I've got friends, similar to that lady, I've got a friend I've known for 30 years who's the kindest, loveliest person in the world that's been completely radicalised.
We've got one as well. One of my mum's oldest mates who lives in Florida has gone down it as well.
No, she's in the UK.
Good Lord.
She lives 12 miles away from me. And there's absolutely no convincing her that Donald Trump is not the Lord Saviour that Jesus sent down to save the world. And there's no... I've had to literally unfollow her on social media because I cannot cope with the
madness. How will she process the sacking, do you think? Because it was interesting to hear that, as you alluded to there, some people are already dressing it up as some sort of... proof of what they already believed is probably the easiest way to put it, even though that involves contortions the like of which we've never seen before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unbelievable conspiracy theories. I mean, he's definitely going to be Donald Trump's running mate if Carrie Lake or Marjorie Taylor Greene's not. He's the only other news station that would probably have him is Newsmax, which means nothing. But the noise is... It's loud, but it's not very big. Whilst I was really concerned a couple of years ago about Trump coming back, I'm actually not now because of everything that's happening with him legally. But secondly, when you look at these silly rallies, etc., he has, they're getting smaller and smaller. The noise is getting smaller and smaller. And I believe eventually, because of what's happened to Fox, the other news outlets will go, hang on a second, let's be careful what we're portraying here, what we're presenting and actually what we're sharing.
I'll take your optimism. And then the one that's even farther out than Fox News, this Newsmax station, will end up being in the sort of fringes where it so obviously belongs to be.
Well, I would hope so.
Yeah, I would too, but I'd take a little bit of whatever you're on, I think, in terms of the optimism for that.
Well, I'm just hoping. I'm really, really hoping. You look at Liz Cheney, and whilst I do not agree with a lot of what Liz Cheney, represents, I do agree with the fact that she is a true Republican.
Yeah,
and I think that's what America needs to get back to. And
that's another reflection.
I would applaud that.
Another reflection of British politics, Kieran, there as well, in that, the post-Brexit Conservative politician is 100 miles away from the pre-Brexit Conservative politician, where you could point at someone like Amber Rudd or Philip Hammond and disagree with them about lots and lots of things, but they weren't denying the existence of observable reality in the way that people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nadine Dorries, the British equivalent in many ways of Marjorie Taylor Greene. And of course they have their very cosy relationships with the media as well. I think they've both got TV shows now, and Nadine Dorries has a column in the Daily Mail, which I don't really want to put much business their way, but you should read it. It's so funny. And it's as if I don't know how to put this I don't want to put it politely particularly, but it's as if, you've been reading a lot about chatbots. Imagine if you had happened upon the idea that because these AI bots are capable now of writing journalism and writing columns, you're going to write something so stupid that no one's going to suspect it was written by AI. That seems to be the mission that Nadine Dorries has been set at the Daily Mail. She's going to become the first columnist whose language is so infantile and whose points are so stupid that nobody would think that it could have been done by a computer. It's almost like a rearguard action against AI columnists by saying, I don't think you'll find a computer as crass and thick as this. And there she is, producing the goods every Tuesday. So thank you, Kieran. Gay's in Bath. Gay, what would you like to say?
Well, I think everybody said everything.
Don't come on the radio and do that, Gay. I've got another 20 minutes.
No, I'm very glad to see Tucker Carlson gone.
Yeah.
But he and Trump have created, it's not like the Republican Party, it's turned into a cult. And you cannot have proper conversations with people about it. I've got friends in Vegas. And if I ring up and say, well, now, finally, do you see what he's done when it comes to the 6th of January? And I said, well, and they'll say, well, we're just watching these people walking through the Capitol building. I said, turn over to CNN because it isn't. And even now, it's like, I don't know who came up with if you tell a lie 3 times, everybody believes it's the truth.
I don't know that either.
Yeah.
Probably Goebbels.
I don't know, Boris Johnson? I don't know. But it's sort of like the Trump way of, the Trump politics has gone to Brazil. And you think, what? All these politicians that are now becoming sort of...
No, it was Donald Trump. If you tell a lie 3 times, they will believe it. It's in The Art of the Deal, which, of course, he didn't actually write. The ghostwriter was one of Donald Trump's earliest and most vociferous critics.
But I think one of the scary things is it's just come out a little bit on the news today in Georgia, where is it Fannie Willis or something is the Attorney General. She's looked up and said today she's not going to announce whether she's going to
Come on, take your time.
Make charges against Trump for the conversation with Brad Raffensperger over the Find Me 11,000 vote until sort of July or September. But she's written to the police and other officials to say, beware, if this is what's going to happen, you've got to have things in place.
So giving them a bit of a heads up.
They're worried about what the reaction
about how the
will
public
be.
Would respond to the rule of law being imposed upon their hero.
Yeah.
Well, we know that's what happens in fascistic scenarios, isn't it? It's the rule of the law for the actual approved characters is the first thing to do. I'm a bit embarrassed by the callers demonstrating a much greater grasp of American politics and media than I have. Okay, that's about three of you now have put me to shame.
What has Trump got over what you would have considered to be reasonable people? It's like Kevin McCarthy, who said, well, what he's done is disgusting after the 6th of January. And then the next minute, he's trooping down to Mar-a-Lago. And
he won. He's a winner. He was a winner. And I mean, there's 2 questions there to unpack. The first is obvious in that these people will prioritise their own career over anything that remotely resembles principle, even if they have to hold their nose to do so.
And so integrity isn't something that is in their language.
No, of course not. No. It doesn't even feature at all. It's a luxury you can indulge when you're over the line electorally, but until you're over the line electorally, integrity doesn't get a look in. And I've spent years thinking about this, and unfortunately the answer to the other question, which is what does Trump offer people that makes him a winner in the way that he is a winner, and that's just white supremacism.
Well, also, he's a grifter. Imagine how much, I'd love, in this country we have election rules about how much money you can spend on a campaign. There, it's like, he prints off little, cigarette cards and charges people for them.
I know.
And I bet the reason he was so miffed that Joe Biden won was because Joe Biden ran his campaign from, as he said, the basement. He did, because it was COVID, he didn't go all over the states, whereas Trump was holding the big rallies. And I think the people that went to the rallies thought, oh, well, we've done our bit now. And I think they forgot to vote.
Yes. I've got to go. You've made me late for the break. I look forward to our next conversation, Gay. And I stress again, I am a little bit embarrassed by the schooling that I'm getting on an area that I would once have thought was in my field of expertise. I started the show today, I said it's a bit media this. I don't know if people are going to be as interested in it as I am. I think every caller has demonstrated a better grasp of the issues under discussion than I have managed to demonstrate myself. Ho-hum, it's a good job it's such a collegiate exercise. 12:51 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the contemplation of Tucker Carlson's departure from Fox News continues to shock and engage in equal measure. I've got to tell you, Yvette Cooper will be taking calls on LBC from 4 p.m. today with Tom Swarbrick. So if you'd like to put a question directly to her, well, there you go. As if by magic. I said next time we get a chance to talk to Yvette Cooper, I'd love to talk to her about these plans on teaching respect. And Tom will let you do just that from 4 o'clock. Any questions you've got for her with regard to Labour's plans to prevent misogyny and violence, to teach respect for women to men, or for girls to boys, then you can do so by giving us a call in the usual way. Remember as well that she's Shadow Home Secretary, so that will be bringing in crime, Rwanda, small boats, all manner of other issues as well. And some people don't really believe us when we do these phone-ins with politicians. It is anything you want. You can bring up anything you want. I mean, in fact, if you're a headline chaser, and I'm sure neither Tom or I fall into that category, then the callers that embarrass the politicians or put them on the spot in a particular fashion are even more welcome, perhaps, than the callers that are not seeking to do that. So whether it's Sadiq Khan or on my show or Yvette Cooper on Tom's show today, don't ever hold back on the grounds that you don't think your question will be put for. I mean, as long as it's decent and not sort of libelous or insightful or anything like that. 12:53 is the time. Back to Tucker Carlson. Bill's in Motherwell. Bill, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James. Big admirer, by the way.
Thank you.
Tucker Carlson is very much in the sort of mode of the cult of personality that seems to have settled into the right wing in American politics. So that, for instance, when Trump will probably win the primaries, but I don't think he'll win the next.
He'll get the nomination, but not necessarily win the election. That seems to be where the clever money is at the moment, and the polling.
Yeah. So,
and in fact, I wonder whether there's going to be an abandonment of Trump by Fox in general, which may actually start translating into different numbers on the primaries as well. We don't know, do we?
We don't really know, but I think there is a possibility of that, definitely. But I think if Trump does win the primaries, he won't win the general, and then with DeSantis seemingly, doing a nosedive, the cult of personality thing is just set up nicely for Tucker. Now, I was really amazed. Was it a year ago he went to Hungary?
Did he?
And he did his programme from Hungary and stood on stage with Orban.
I didn't know that. I don't follow this stuff as closely as I should. I thought I was obsessed with it, but every caller today knows more about this stuff than I do. So sitting there with, here it is, in the last few nights in Budapest, I've run into a number of Americans who have come here because they want to be around people who agree with them. That's what he said to Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. That's like a country as an echo chamber, really. I thought they were against that sort of thing.
Yeah, but also in Russia, Tucker's like a big hero to, the old brigade, so to speak, Putin and his mates. They put the state television are always putting Tucker Carlson on because he says exactly what the Putin propaganda machine is saying.
So he was very warm towards Russia, very chilling towards, negative towards Ukraine. I wonder what actually did for him in the end. I wonder what made them decide that the line had been crossed, because the numbers are still there, the figures are still there.
I mean, my big worry is that there's always been this thing of Trump was an idiot, but what if the next guy's quite intelligent? That's what we've got to be
and just as nasty.
About. Yeah.
Well, that would be like Orban then. An American Orban is what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah. DeSantis, I think, has shot himself in the foot. He doesn't seem to have the kind of social skills or
the demagoguery. I'm going to crack on because I'm saving the analysis of the broader American political picture for another day, Bill. And folk, you're someone I would look forward to talking to when that day dawns. But for now, I just want to steer it back towards Carlson and Fox News in particular. Daryl's in Hickling in Leicestershire. Daryl, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, James.
Daryl.
Yeah, a long time no talk. I've got two sisters. I've got two sisters in America, and you know how you've talked before about Brexit, and you know how much interest I take in the English.
Yes. Go on.
So I'm just as much into the Americans now with YouTube.
Are you flying a kite at the moment, Daryl?
No, I'm just out in the field.
It sounds like you're going to get blown away.
Yeah, I'm just in the field.
What, in your own field?
Yeah, in my own field.
You're farming.
No, I'm not a farmer, but I've got a bit of a.
You just got. Well, you're going to have to. I've only got a minute, so make it snappy.
Yeah. I just talk to my sister on FaceTime every other week, and I've got one sister that's really pro-Trump, and I've got the other sister that's seen the light, and of course it splits the family, doesn't it?
Of course it does. What made her see the light?
I don't know. She's a Mormon. We're brought up Mormons.
Okay.
And she's been a Mormon all her life, Amanda has. And then she's suddenly sort of seen the light. I don't know why. I finished with the religion when I was about in my 17s.
Okay.
And I'm now 74.
Yes.
And she's seen the light, and it's the other sister that's the problem, you know.
And how much of her situation is down to Fox News or down to Tucker Carlson?
I think Amanda, with talking to me, the younger sister has looked beyond. But Viv, I can't get through because Mormons are Republicans. So
always, so it doesn't matter who's carrying the nomination. They get their support. Which takes us back to the first call, actually, which also speaking about a sister-in-law rather than a sister. The difference between what we would call a traditional Republican and what you'd call a Trump supporter, they're worlds apart. But I guess if you're just voting for the badge, then you're voting for the both of them. Daryl, thank you. I'm sorry I didn't have longer to talk to you. It's my fault. I should have come to you a bit sooner. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also rewind live radio. I wonder when I'm going to stop being so excited about that. Or enjoy the whole show podcast. You'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as the best video clips from LBC and other global stations. Rewind live radio.
I thought you were taking the mick every time you said it like that.
You're joking, aren't you?
No, I'm not.
It's so exciting. Rewind live radio on Global Play. I think I'm on the Capital Breakfast Show tomorrow. You can rewind it to check. Talking about my appearance later today on Celebrity Eggheads, actually, which I'd forgotten to plug. I'm glad I managed to squeeze that in. Channel 5. What time, Keith? Yes. So download that for free, the Global Player, from your App Store or from globalplayer.com. Tom Sawbrick with you at 4, joined, of course, from the top of the show by Yvette Cooper. But now she's already announced her presence.
I always do. I'm terrible, Muriel.
It's Sheila Fogarty.
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 Muriel.
It's Sheila